NOMADS 6. New Alliances. By Alan J. Stark. Prologue. Davis and Skorsky. Raymond Davis had had a bad feeling right from the start. The landing of the fleet on the planet Akkato, which the Aponi used for their gemstone mining, had been a disaster. Admiral Gorak Mestre, one of Zurak's younger brothers, had started the whole campaign too carelessly and almost unprepared. He had simply underestimated the strength and numbers of the Kimon units, and now the Neoda's command boat lay a burning wreck in the dense jungle of one of the many mining worlds, while the Neoda itself had been forced to retreat and leave the system. The surviving Akkato and the Admiral's 200 or so human guardsmen gathered around the wrecked ship in the rainforest, from whose leaves and branches the drops of water from the storm that had just passed were falling. Wisps of mist rose up into the treetops in the sultry air, which smelled of rotting leaves. The sun had just reappeared, and swarms of buzzing insects gathered in the rays that poked through the canopy. The sun's rays, which shone down like bright lances of light, almost had the heat of burning glasses where they hit the skin. Davis hated the tropics. He could cope with deserts, but the changing, warm and humid climate of rainforests almost drove him out of his mind. Of all the worlds to crash on, it had to be this sweaty, steamy planet. Davis signed out to one of the Akkato officers, pretending to want to explore the area. In truth, however, he just wanted to be alone for a few moments to forget the past events and get away from the hustle and bustle. He walked through the jungle for a while until the noise of the soldiers and the crackling of the flames could barely be heard. Davis lit a cigarette. A comrade's own construction, who had found a quite passable tobacco substitute in a certain type of leaf and dried it in a cargo chamber of the Neoda. An elaborate procedure, which also cost accordingly. Davis had to pay a fingernail-sized gold coin, equivalent to 1/10 of a month's wages, for 10 pieces. He therefore enjoyed every puff, even if he had already given up smoking for the sake of circumstances. As he let the minutes pass, he observed his surroundings. Everything was silent and gave the impression that the entire animal world had hid itself away to seek safety from the battles that were about to break out in the rainforest. Only the rushing and splashing of a stream could be heard as it meandered over stones and mossy rocks through its winding bed. Davis had just taken the last drag from his cigarette and thrown the stub away when he noticed a movement. A beetle, its body the size of a man's fist, detached itself from the wrinkled bark of a tree with a piercing hum and flew towards him. It circled around Davis and descended on him angrily once or twice. Davis could see a blue-black stinger protruding a few inches from its abdomen. Venom dripped from its tip, emitting a pungent odor reminiscent of formic acid. The breath of its transparent, vibrating wings could be clearly felt as it attacked the human, flying past his head again and again. Davis waited for the right moment and struck the insect with the butt. He hit it, accompanied by a hard bang, as if he had caught a stone in flight. The beetle fell to the ground, but stirred and began to flap its wings again. But before it could rise into the air again, Davis crushed it with the butt of his gun. Blood and poison sprayed over the plants covering the forest floor. A cloud of scent rose up, stinging Davis's eyes and nose like poison gas. He coughed, took a swig from the canteen on his belt and washed his face with the rest of the water. Fortunately, the burning subsided. Relief spread, because from his time studying in the Amazon region, he was familiar with the poison of much smaller insects, which was not so easy to wash off and caused considerably more pain. He was glad that this beetle was just a show-off. "Bloody poser," growled Davis, wiping his face with his sleeve. He was happy that he had managed to avoid coming into contact with the bug's stinger. Davis turned away and continued to explore the area around the crash site. If only it weren't for the damn heat, which made every step a torture. It covered the forest like a heavy, suffocating blanket. Sweat trickled down Davis's forehead and stung his eyes. He stepped into a stream that rippled through the black earth, scooped up the water with his hand and splashed it on his face. He took a sip. For a few moments, it helped him to forget the sultry heat and was enough to fill Davis with new strength. He followed the course of the stream and after a few moments the forest thinned out. Soon Davis was standing on the edge of a huge artificial canyon that the Aponi mining units had dug into the planet's crust. A huge gash gaped in the planet's skin and stretched to the horizon, where the contours of the canyon, with its countless terraces, were lost in the haze. He saw smoke rising from the valley and recognized the wreckage of several vehicles that had just gone up in flames. Not far away, an Aponi ship had hit the edge of the huge pit and broken in two. The tip had drilled into the jungle just over the edge, and the stern lay below, shattered on the steep side of the canyon. A Kimon blade descended straight out of the sky and touched down next to the wreckage. Davis could see the swarm of sniffers already moving along the steep walls. They were still too far away for him to feel them, but that might change in the next few hours. Surely they would soon be approaching to see what was going on with the Akkato ship that had crashed a few minutes ago. Davis wondered why Gorak had embarked on this adventure, which took him to a world where the Aponi were in charge. Akkato and Aponi were not hostile to each other, but they usually avoided each other. The traits of the two races were too different for them to get along without difficulty. They obviously respected each other, but smiled at each other's philosophy of life. But the Akkato's attitude actually applied to all species that colonized Askarun. The Akkato put a lot of stock in their traditions, which made them appear arrogant in the eyes of others. And perhaps they were not so wrong in this. The Akkato were solitary people who looked down on others with pride and made no secret of the fact that they considered their culture to be superior in every respect. So why this contact with the Aponi, Davis wondered. The venture on Keto must be promising in material terms, for Gorak was no idealist seeking to improve relations between the two peoples. Certainly the diamonds that were being dug for on Keto played a decisive role in the whole affair. But even there, the horseheads usually made sure that bureaucrats from their ranks took care of the matter instead of warriors, who were a touch more arrogant. They would never stoop to the level of merchants, who were considered a lower caste among the Akkato. Not least because they were in close contact with the other peoples of the galaxy and were prepared to compromise. As he pondered, he noticed that the ground around the wreck of the Aponi ship glistened in the sunlight. It was probably a freighter carrying diamonds, which were traded in Askarun as a raw material and currency. On Earth, even the smallest gemstone from Aponi production could buy entire regions. The Aponi not only owned the most valuable mines, they were also excellent at processing the stones. What a shame that the equivalent of an entire solar system now lay scattered on the floor of the canyon. The gems glisten on the rocks and stones like freshly fallen snow. Davis then took a closer look around and noticed that the forest floor was littered with countless diamond shards. The freighter must have lost a considerable part of its cargo before it hit the ground and scattered it over the treetops. Davis bent down and picked up many of the white gems. He found polished and uncut ones. Most were barely larger than grains of rice, but there were some the size of coffee beans or cherries. It couldn't hurt to take a few with him. He looked around in all directions before putting them in one of the provision pouches on his belt and an empty wooden tube that normally contained medicine. He felt uneasy as he did so. For even in the face of abundance, the Aponi and the Akkato claimed every single stone that was lost as their own, no matter how tiny. Davis felt like he was about to plunder the big bank in Dubai. He felt his pulse quicken, making his carotid artery throb, and the beads of sweat on his forehead coalesce into thick drops that ran down his nose and cheeks. He then stuffed a handkerchief into the food bag to prevent the stones from rattling treacherously in their leather container. "We should try to put out the fires," said Pavel Skorsky, who had followed Davis, "and turn the wreck into a fortress." He also observed the landing of the Kimon blade, which was now sinking its landing legs into the ground. Davis winced. "What do you mean?" "The wreck," Skorsky repeated. "We should try to save it." "I see." "Yes. Of course." Skorsky looked at his friend in amazement. He didn't seem to have noticed what was lying at his feet, and Davis thought it best not to say a word about it. Instead, he splashed another handful of water on his face and stood up. Together they looked down into the canyon. Skorsky pointed the barrel of his rifle down into the ravine. "Here come our friends. There are quite a few of them." Davis was still busy organizing his thoughts. "Gorak will do just that, won't he?" Skorsky seemed preoccupied with determining the exact number of approaching skelks. What to do? Turn the wreck into a fortress. Skorsky peered through the sight of his weapon to take a closer look at the skelks. Doesn't look like it. I advised him to, but he's against it. What's he up to? There's supposed to be an Aponi base, Skorsky replied, shouldering his rifle and pointing vaguely in the direction he had come from. About 10 or 12 kilometers away. But we have no contact. It's hard to say if there's anything there at all. Davis straightened up and put his fists on his hips. What do we know about this world? Only what we've seen so far, said Skorsky. But the Akkato say that the jungle of Quito has a name. So? Skorsky grinned in a mixture of amusement and fear. The Aponi word for it is Uretaharu. It can be translated as Soul Eater. Sounds quite exciting, Davis replied with an effortless cheerfulness. Our dark souls will give the Yuri thingy a thorough stomach upset. What do you think? Should we try to change Gorak's mind? He doesn't listen to what we say. I disagree with that. I think he thinks the world of us now. Skorsky rubbed his chin. We've more than proved ourselves in the last few months. And the new recruits we've brought him have all proved to be excellent. That's why I don't want to lose them again, Davis replied sharply. Not because of a pointless trek through unknown territory where we might encounter hordes of skelks. We need to build up a position and wait for help, even if that sounds less exciting than a forced march through this jungle of death. If this is really that important to you, then talk to Gorak and convert him. That would be your duty. Skorsky put his fists on his hips. Your mission, for the good of our charges, he added pathetically. After all, our brothers and sisters from Earth wouldn't be here if you hadn't invited them. It bothered Davis a little that Skorsky was trying to get out of the affair with these words, as if the whole thing was none of his business, but he didn't want to start an argument about it now. His friend was right. He should finally stand up on his hind legs and stand up to Gorak. Akkato's failures were increasing and his father Ulan Mestre was now taking notice. Envoys from the prince's court had arrived several times to inquire about Gorak's activities and the progress of his conquests. After a verbal outburst from the prince's son, they had left in displeasure, leaving no doubt that his father would be very disappointed. Fortunately for him, Ulan Mestre was very interested in Earth and its inhabitants at the moment and therefore spent little time questioning his son's actions. Obviously, the visit of the emissaries had taken place at the instigation of the administrators who were currently in charge of the palace on Otrakan. Otherwise Gorak would not have dared to answer them so rudely. The absence of their father gave Gorak and his older brother Zurak enough freedom to increase their sphere of power and influence. However, they lacked their father's strategic skill and were currently wasting more resources than House Mestre could sustain. Davis and Skorsky had recruited a good 400 people to serve as guardsmen and bodyguards to protect Gorak. A luxury that not even the prince indulged in and who regarded this as a quirk. Especially as the humans were nothing more than fragile creatures in his eyes, who could in no way replace the protection offered by a squadron of well-trained Akkato. An argument that was just gaining momentum, as the recklessness of the prince's son, who held the rank of admiral, had caused enormous losses among the troops. Now there were only 63 human soldiers left to ensure Akkato's safety. This small remnant could not be allowed to be senselessly sacrificed now. You're right, said Davis. I'll talk to Gorak. Don't speak. Skorsky replied sharply. Convince him. You have to get him to stay here. We won't last forever, but we'll last a lot longer than the madness he's planning. And we can also deal out good blows this way and at least sell our skin for a good price. Before the Kimon tear us to pieces. Davis smiled bitterly. Looks like this is our Alamo. So what if I do? I have no intention of leaving quietly. I'd rather do it with a bang. Gorak was very tall, even by Akkato standards. He towered over the tallest of his kind by a good meter. From his grim expression, framed by a rust-red mane with gold and gemstones woven into it, it was clear that he didn't think much of Davi's proposal. He didn't want to entrench himself and hope to be rescued. In his opinion, the prospect of help from the Aponi, who were obviously under severe pressure themselves, was more than slim. In Gorak's eyes, it was braver to march through the jungle and face the enemy openly, if he dared to attack them at all. After all, his soldiers were among the best elite fighters House Mestre could muster. Davis was amazed at so much foolhardiness. In contrast to his brother Zurek, Gorak was more reserved, although no less prone to rash, spontaneous decisions. "The fires in the ship have largely been extinguished," said Davis. "We can mine the area around the wreck and form defensive lines. Even if we have to retreat into the ship, we can inflict significant casualties on the enemy. If the Kimon strike from orbit, it will be over with us very quickly," Gorak replied. Unlike most Akkato, he pronounced human words with less of an accent, and knew how to use them well. As with all horseheads, his voice rolled through the forest like thunder. "It's only a matter of time before they wear us down and starve us out. And then we're finished." Of course, Gorak was not entirely wrong. But the choice was only between two evils, of which the march through the jungle was the greater. "If we fight our way through the jungle, an orbital attack will finish us off even faster," Davis countered. "The command module shield system and defense batteries are still operational. The reactor still supplies enough energy to keep all systems active. The Kimon will think twice before daring to fire on us. We can dish it out better than they think possible." Of course, this assessment was exaggerated. The damage was considerable, even if it would have saved a lot of the ship. Davis couldn't help but think of the beetle that had attacked him and tried to sting him with its venomous thorn. In the end, Davis had smashed it with the butt of his rifle, and apart from a stinking cloud of scent that made him retch for a moment, nothing else had happened. Gorak was right. If no help arrived, the butt of the gun would come down from the sky and crush them all. "We don't know how the situation has developed," Akkato insisted. "It may be that the Kimon were unable to establish ships in orbit. Then they won't be dropping any more units to cause us problems." "I saw one of her blades," Davis said. "It's landed. I assume they only do that when they can't take fire from space. So the bugs have orbital sovereignty and have decided to land and deploy ground forces. If we move through the jungle, we'll have to deal with warriors and skelks and can't hide behind interdiction fields." Gorak ignored the guardsman's words. "The Aponi base looked undamaged, and if the crew is still there, we have better options than to hole up here and wait to see what they rain down on us. We know nothing about the base." Gorak took a step towards the human. "Are you afraid of snakes and vermin? The Aponi think this forest holds greater dangers than that. I don't care about Aponi tales. Exaggerations to make it seem like the long ears are brave fighters and conquerors." The Aponi, whom Gorak disparagingly referred to as long ears, were equal fighters. Davis knew that these creatures, very similar to humans, were extremely fierce warriors. They may be less physically strong than the Akkato, but they more than made up for it with their cleverness and skill. "If we don't find anyone there," Davis continued, "we're screwed. We can't even send a signal to our fleet and draw attention to ourselves. We'll take a transmitter with us and use the equipment there as an amplifier," Gorak replied. "And now get your people ready to march." "If there's anything left to use there," Davis almost retorted, but for Gorak the debate was over and it was better not to irritate him too much. Davis complied with Gorak's order, but he couldn't help but show his displeasure. While the Akkato and the humans retrieved all kinds of equipment from the Nyota to take with them on the march, he observed the forest. He ordered his men to take only the bare essentials and load as much material as possible onto one of the 8-legged transporters. It was late afternoon when the sky clouded over and a heavy rain began to fall, which lasted well into the night. The troop of men in Akkato had been on the move for hours, fighting their way through the dense undergrowth as thick, warm drops fell on the soldiers. Lightning flickered above the treetops and cast bizarre shadows in the jungle. The crashing of the thunder and the sound of the water and wind blended into an ominous soundscape in which it was difficult to make out approaching enemies. At least for the Akkato. They lacked the special sense of the humans, who were now becoming restless. Davis also clearly felt the presence of the Kimon and could also determine the direction from which a herd was approaching. But there was also something else that worried him when a flash of lightning lit up the area. Davis couldn't say exactly what it was that made him wonder. He thought something was missing that had been there before the lightning flickered. "Get ready," he barked an order into the roar of the storm. "Unload the repeating launcher." The soldiers lifted a heavy gun mounted on a tripod from the walking machine and brought it into position. No further orders were needed to tell the experienced fighters where to aim the destructive power of the weapon and when the best moment was to unleash it. As soon as it was aimed, a female gunner wedged herself behind the sight and launched a volley of glowing projectiles between the trees. In the light of the explosions, the bodies of the skelks could be seen, no longer hiding, approaching between the ferns and bushes. Many were hit, torn to shreds or fell mutilated to the ground. However, the onslaught only came to a brief halt. Only when the soldiers opened fire from their rifles did they bring the attackers to a halt. Many of the creatures fled and the few who dared to continue their attack were struck down. "And on we go," Davis ordered, and the gun was loaded back onto the stilts. "We don't want to lose our horse-headed friends." They had only taken a few steps when a soldier marching a few meters in front of Davis was suddenly thrown into the air. Davis thought the man had stepped on a mine, but there was no explosion. No flames, no bang. The same thing happened to another comrade, and only now did Davis see the tentacles wrapped around their bodies. Shots rang out from the unfortunate soldiers' weapons as they were hurled through the air and shaken around. Skorsky raised his rifle and fired at a massive rootstock that looked like the remnant of a felled tree the troop had just passed. From its splintered stump, which opened like a mouth, more tentacles twitched, groping for new victims, while the two unfortunate guardsmen disappeared into its open maw. On the right flank of the troop, another monster began to fish people out of the ranks of the soldiers. It managed to grab an Akkato and stuff it into its maw. Then it reared up like a snake and groped for more victims with its tentacles. A detonation threw up earth and stones and caused the creature to stagger for a moment. Davis detached a grenade from his belt and hurled it at the attacker. The explosive detonated without causing much damage, but it was enough to drive the creature back into the forest. His companion also came under heavy fire and disappeared back into the darkness of the jungle. "Don't get left behind," Davis shouted, pointing to the front of the company, where Gorak and most of his comrades were. "Open up. Unlock." In the minutes during the battle, the main Akkato group had put a considerable distance between themselves and the humans. Apparently they had so much confidence in the fighting ability of their human comrades that they had no problem leaving the fighting to them alone. It was not easy to catch up with the horseheads, who were setting a good pace. It was only thanks to the difficult terrain that they had not already made off over all the mountains. The humans, on the other hand, followed the path of trampled-down woodland that the Akkato had cut through the forest. It was reasonably easy to make progress here. Skorsky had only one bitter remark for the Akkato. "Seems we're supposed to stick our necks out while they try to save their leathery skins." Davis had to agree with him. Their behavior was strange. The Akkato were not actually cowards who shied away from a fight. On the contrary. Sometimes the combative troop that Gorak had gathered around him caused problems because they threw themselves into the fracas without thinking. "I didn't think our situation was so hopeless," Davis muttered angrily. Suddenly, a hiss filled the air, drowning out the thunder and the sound of the rain for a moment. Something was flying low over the treetops. The cracking and splintering of wood could be heard, then there was a muffled bang as the unknown object smashed into the forest floor. "What the hell?" Skorsky cursed, wiping sweat and rainwater from his face. The other soldiers also paused for a moment and listened in the direction of the impact, but nothing else happened that deserved their attention. Lightning flashed above the treetops and drew bizarre shadows on the forest floor. At the moment, every bush and rock looked like a monster about to attack. Thunder cracked and rolled through the night. A gust of wind howled over the treetops and felled a tree, which crashed to the ground with a rumble. "Keep going!" Davis shouted against the storm, which was shaking the treetops with undiminished force and occasionally raining down leaves and branches. They hadn't gone much further when the strange process repeated itself a few more times. Once again, hissing sounds filled the air, followed by impacts. Sometimes close by, sometimes further away. What in three devils' names is going on? Skorsky cursed. Artillery? Davis doubted that. I don't hear or see any explosions. Would be a nice line of unexploded ordnance that just rained down there. Meteorites? Or debris from ships that fall from orbit? Skorsky rubbed his chin skeptically. Let's hope another battleship doesn't fall on our heads. The troop moved close behind the Akkatos again, fighting their way through the thicket like a herd of primeval monsters. Finally, the storm subsided and some calm returned. However, Davis didn't think they had been alone for a few minutes. He felt like he was being watched and thought he heard noises like those usually made by a flock of Kimon. He kept turning around, listening and peering into the darkness, but all he could hear was the falling of leaves, twigs and raindrops that fell through the branches after the storm. What's wrong? Skorsky wanted to know, his friend's restlessness making him nervous. I can't feel anything. What are you worrying about? There are no Kimon or Skelks around. That was what worried Davis. If it wasn't Kimon, who could it be that was following them? Or were his nerves so tense that he was now seeing ghosts? Esther Van Beek, the shooter who had previously handled the heavy rifle, dropped back a little until she was level with Davis and Skorsky, who, along with a few others, continued to bring up the rear. We have guests, she said in a conspiratorial tone and looked anxiously into the darkness. There. Between the trees. There are trees everywhere, laughed Skorsky. I mean there. The young woman pointed to a spot to her left flank. A moss-covered rock rose there, illuminated by the flickering lightning. Did you see it? Yes, Davis had noticed the creature, which immediately ducked into the undergrowth at the foot of the rock. It was not alone. Davis thought he recognized several other of these creatures hiding among the trees, staring at them like a pride of lions in a thicket. They're not Kimon, said Skorsky, horror written all over his face. They're bigger. And darker in color. A special breed? Asked Esther Van Beek. How should I know? Davis replied. Go back to the front of the line and tell people to stay calm. Nobody shoots unless I shoot, got it? Got it, the young woman confirmed and set off. Skorsky checked the energy status of his rifle. They could have attacked us long ago. Yes, they would have, Davis agreed. If they were ordinary snoopers, there would have already been another fight. From a distance, a roar reached her ears, followed by a hiss that ended in an agonized cry of pain. That was a Kimon, came almost simultaneously from Davis and Skorsky's lips. Are they native creatures? Skorsky wondered. Some kind of critters? Looks like it, said Davis. If they're defending their territory, they've probably already got us in their sights. Do they have anything to do with the meteorites that crashed down earlier? Then they weren't meteors, but space capsules. But the monsters don't look like they could steer ships. It didn't look like they had to do much steering either. Davis thought the idea that someone had dropped the monsters into the jungle using space capsules was absurd. Who would do something like that? Perhaps the Kimon have a new strategy, Skorsky ventured to speculate. Davis would have liked to disagree, but he had to admit that he had no better explanation than his friend. I wonder if there's a third war party we don't know about yet. Skorsky seemed to be stumped. Be that as it may, he growled. They're welcome to get to know me. However, nothing happened over the next few minutes that would have prompted the troops to react violently against their pursuers. The soldiers made their way through the jungle unmolested. The strange creatures followed, but kept their distance. But every soldier, whether human or Akkato, knew by now that they had companions who did not give a harmless impression. Davis decided to ask Gorak if he had any information about the strange beings and began to work his way through the rows of horseheads at their head when he sensed the presence of Skelks. They were very close. His comrades had also noticed the presence of the snoopers and unslung their weapons. Once again, the heavy gun was unloaded and brought into position. Esther Van Beek slid a new energy magazine into the gun and waited for the order to fire. Where have our new companions gone? Skorsky wondered. Davis suspected that the creatures were hiding in the thicket. But the vegetation in this part of the forest was not so tall and lush that the large creatures could have hidden in it. To all appearances, they were gone. Except for the distant rumble of thunder, silence had once again spread through the jungle. Not a sound could be heard. No wind, no rustling of leaves. Apart from the oppressive sensations that the proximity of the skelks caused in people's minds, there was no indication that a fight was about to break out. But suddenly the silence was broken by screams and deafening roars. At the same time, Davis felt the fear and panic of the skelks as if they were his own feelings. Images of bared teeth and sharp claws flashed through his mind. It was almost painful, the intensity with which they were punched into his mind. In the fight against the sniffers, it rarely happened with such force. The adrenaline released prevented the Keeman's thoughts from spreading too far into the human's neurons. Davis involuntarily began to recite his mantra, which drove the skelk's emotions out of his head in these situations. The will is the only reality, he whispered, and combined with a few strong breaths, it helped him to focus on the real environment. The will is the only reality. Meanwhile, the noise of battle continued to rise and echoed eerily through the forest. Shots, roars and screams echoed back and forth between the trees. Suddenly, a skelk burst through the undergrowth and found itself in the midst of the guardsmen. Before it could do any damage with its teeth and claws, it was torn to pieces by a hail of bullets. Davis felt the rush of more skelks fleeing from their new foes. Open fire, he barked out his order and fired at the first of a whole herd of sniffers who were charging in a mixture of wild panic and aggression. Several of the Keeman were hit and killed by the volleys. The creatures could almost see their irritation, so vague and uncertain were their actions. Before they could prepare a meaningful defense, Esther Van Beek had opened fire and cut down about 10 skelks. When the last of them was killed and their thoughts disappeared from the minds of the humans, silence fell over the night once more. The clouds of smoke dissipated, and in the weather light of the distant storm, the large creatures that were still unknown to the guardsmen now emerged from between the trees. For the first time, it was possible to take a closer look at them. The creatures appeared larger and bulkier than the skelks. Their bodies appeared to be blue-black in color, even if it was difficult to tell in the darkness. Their skin was also covered in shimmering golden patterns that began to glow when the creatures moved. Like the sniffers, arm and finger-thick tentacles hung from their heads in thick manes that coiled and curled like bundles of snakes. What a sight, Skorsky murmured, staring down the barrel of his rifle at the creatures, just as agitated as his comrades. Davis heard the Akkato set off again to finally reach the Aponi station. At least the secret was out. For the Akkato, the monsters were nothing unusual and probably posed no danger. Neither for horseheads nor for their human soldiers. They marched off calmly, unperturbed by the presence of the creatures. New generation of guardsmen. Skorsky concluded. Anyway, we now know who sent them. Then it would be just as easy to get us out of here, Davis replied, annoyed. What kind of game is Gorak playing with us? Skorsky shouldered his rifle. You're asking me too much. I'm just afraid we'll be out of a job and we'll have to go back to the damn mining planets. Chapter 1. Dawn was breaking. The first rays of sunlight poking through the foliage woke up countless insects, which buzzed in swarms around the soldiers' heads. Wisps of mist wafted through the warm air. It already felt stuffy and unpleasantly sticky. As they stumbled through the jungle the previous night, Davis had longed for the storm and downpour to finally stop. The incessant showers, which penetrated even the dense canopy of the jungle, had soaked him to the bone. But Davis had completely forgotten how uncomfortable the sweltering heat was that spread under the canopy of the jungle after such a heavy rain. Breathing was difficult in the stagnant air and his pulse began to pound in his temples. The disgusting feeling of damp clothes sticking to his sweaty body almost drove Raymond Davis out of his mind. The water stood in his boots and made smacking noises when he put one foot in front of the other. Davis watched Gorak closely as he walked in the middle of his soldiers. He wondered what the son of the Akkato Prince Ulan Mestre was up to. Ever since the encounter with the monsters who had given the Skelks such a hard time and had been stalking the troop ever since, he had felt betrayed by Gorak. And that, at least, was the most salacious of all the words running through Davis's head. Gorak had a devious and unpredictable character. That was no secret. But so far his malice had been directed at his enemies and all those who challenged his position. The events of the previous night were a turning point, Davis was sure of that. In addition to his annoyance at the Akkato, however, there was also a feeling of danger that he simply could not shake off and that he could not say why he felt it. The worry of being sent back to the mines played a part in this, but there was something else that he couldn't quite put his finger on and that bothered him even more. Davis had finally managed to get to Gorak, who was walking at the head of his warriors. "What kind of monsters are these?" he asked the Akkato. Gorak seemed reluctant to answer the human's question at first. He pretended not to have heard Davis's words, but he smiled to himself as if he were daydreaming or amused by Davis. He looked like someone who was about to tell the punchline of a good joke without being able to hide how much it amused him. "I've never heard of such creatures before," Davis continued. "And nothing about them standing by our side?" "There are many secrets in Ascaron," Gorak replied, cryptic and evasive. "You and your friend. You've only been with us for a few years. So why do you think you know everything there is to know?" "I didn't say that," Davis replied. "I just thought I was informed of all our options in the fight against the Kimon. Or should be informed when changes occur. A mistake, it seems to me." Gorak did not respond to Davis's words. "I'd like to know where they come from." Davis persisted and had to make an effort not to make his words sound disrespectful. "Who are they? What are they? What does it matter?" Gorak had never been good at hiding his disgruntlement and punctuated his words with a muffled growl. "They are here and they serve their purpose. That's enough. That's not good enough for me." The words were on the tip of Davis's tongue, but he did well not to say them. "We humans could be prey for them," he said instead. "That worries me." Gorak nodded in understanding. "I can understand that. But don't worry. We call them Gothreks and they won't hurt you." How could he be so sure? "You give me a very aggressive impression. But that's not all. Their approach seems strategic. I've seen how they've got the Skelks pinned down. Some led the attack, others secured the flanks. A remnant stayed behind to take on runaways and then returned to their posts. It was very impressive. I would like to know whether I should count them more as animals or as rational creatures." Gorak laughed out loud. "Too many thoughts, Ray. You run the risk of me taking you out of the fighting squad and putting you with the philosophers on Otrakin. Then you can think about the nature of consciousness and spend many long hours with Yuri Berinsky." Davis was able to recognize the threat in Akkato's words and refrained from asking any further questions. "That is to be avoided," he said and managed a pained smile before withdrawing from Gorak's company. "What did you find out?" Skorsky wanted to know. "Don't ask," Raymond Davis replied. "But I want to know." "Don't ask," was Gorak's reply. "He doesn't feel like talking about it." Skorsky's expression reflected the same irritation that occupied Davis's thoughts. Davis wiped the sweat from his brow. "Does that have to worry us?" "Definitely me. I meant it rhetorically." Davis looked back at the Gothreks, who were following them at a good distance. Their eyes stared at him. They scrutinized and dissected him as if he were an object under a microscope. "Damn, they're animals," he admonished himself. "They have no thoughts except those that correspond to their instincts." The Aponi base could be seen from the edge of a cliff. It lay in a hollow through which a river meandered and looked like a flat, upturned plate made of brownish clay. The cliff where Gorak and his troop now stood was not particularly steep and a descent to the bottom of the valley should be possible without further problems. Davis expected to reach the base before dusk fell. Provided they didn't run into any more problems with the Kimon. The Akkato didn't want to lose any time and immediately set off on the descent. The Stelzer had a few difficulties climbing over the edge, but once he had completed this passage, he coped quite well with the incline. Esther Van Beek had anchored her minigun to the machine and was perched on the shooter's seat. The heavy weapon and the young woman swayed back and forth during the descent as if they were on the back of a camel. Davis reckoned that the shooter would be thrown off at any moment. A few bets were even placed on whether and when the soldier would kiss the ground. But the troop reached the valley without Esther Van Beek becoming the laughing stock of the troops, even though she looked a little pale and was obviously struggling with nausea. The feeling when Kimon approached was always the same. It felt like a blow to the forehead or a well-placed stomach punch. After a moment of shock, the thoughts usually regained order and made it possible to locate the creatures. Estimating their numbers, however, was another problem. Each person felt differently when encountering the Skelks and faced specific challenges. Davis suspected that anxious people tended to exaggerate the number of Kimon. Confident people, on the other hand, were often surprised at how many opponents they suddenly faced. Davis belonged to the latter group. This made the sensations that had just overcome him all the more alarming. Before he could even give an order, the first soldiers fired shots and Esther Van Beek also raked the undergrowth with volleys from her gun. The Akkato began to run, while the Gothreks were already chasing towards their enemies. Davis was convinced that they had already started moving before he became aware of the Skelk's presence. Again a flood of images marked the clash of the two groups, and again Davis needed a moment to chase away the impressions by reciting his mantra. His head cleared at just the right moment and he was able to deliver a blast of plasma bullets to the Skelks that were about to jump at him. They penetrated his chest and exited his body at the back, scattering a mixture of blood and guts over the vegetation. Follow the Akkato to the station was the only order he had for his soldiers, and there was still time to shout it out before another Skelk chased up. Hard-pressed, the troops worked their way through the jungle, with the transport walker and his riflewoman forming the center of the group. Again and again, the Skelks broke through the ranks of the soldiers, killing more and more people. The losses increased when Esther had to give her overheated gun a rest. She drew her pistol and, from her elevated position, took aim at one Skelk after another until one of the monsters leapt over the bodies of its fellows and caught the young woman. Both fell to the ground and disappeared into the turmoil. What about the Gothreks, damn it? Skorsky cursed, firing precise rifle shots that all found their target. By now they were so close to the Aponi station that they could see its dome through the trees. A landing pad spread out in front of it, which the transport would reach in the next few minutes. A young man had climbed the stilt and began to re-aim the gun. He took aim at the Skelks, who were now approaching in droves. He managed to mow down quite a few of them before the overloaded weapon exploded and tore the gunner to shreds. "Run," yelled Davis. "To the base. Run." A few grenades detonated and killed more Skelks. An explosive charge went off and tore a swathe through the attacking monsters, halting their advance. Another booby trap exploded, hurling the mutilated bodies of the monsters through the air. A tree bent and crashed thunderously to the ground, burying a group of Skelks beneath it. Far from a flawless rearguard action, Davis reflected. But in view of the superior numbers, they were not doing badly. The troops acted perfectly. Nobody lost their nerve. Almost every shot hit its target and the Skelks' advances clearly lost momentum. Davis and his soldiers gained a few seconds and took the opportunity to get out of the jungle. The Akkatos had already formed up on the landing pad and greeted the Skelks with a hail of plasma projectiles, which they sent flying over the heads of the guardsmen. The station's defenses also spewed forth a nightmare of fire and devastation, setting the edge of the forest ablaze. The gunners did not stop firing until they were sure they had burned every single insect around the station to ashes. Davis felt the presence of the Skelks fade from his consciousness. For a moment, he let go of all resistance and willingly absorbed the images into his mind. He saw flames and felt the heat eating away at the monsters' bodies. He felt the panic that gripped them and the fear of death in the face of the inferno in which they were trapped. Gradually, the impressions and feelings faded. When the last Skelk breathed its last, the storm in Davis's mind was over. The calm that then spread through him could hardly be described in words. Like after a thunderstorm that had dispelled the heat of the day and cleared the air, his thoughts were clear and fresh every time afterwards. As if all bad thoughts and emotions had been washed away and died with the skelks. A powerful feeling of invincibility took possession of Davis. He understood why many people sought out the fight and contact with the sniffers. It could be like a drug. At last the gunners stopped firing. It became quiet. The only thing that could still be heard was the crackling of the flames as they ate their way through the jungle. Apart from the panting of the exhausted soldiers, who lay down on the pavement of the landing area to finally get some rest. Skorsky started to speak a few times, but instead he gasped and coughed a curse or two over his lips. He sat down on the sun-heated pavement and began to laugh. He had obviously completely exhausted himself. Davis was still recovering from his exhaustion when the next surprise took his breath away. When the wide doors of the station opened, a group of lizard-like Bosku stepped out. They were the ones he had least expected. The scaly creatures were all heavily armed and looked naturally fierce. They were evidently the pinch of pepper in the strange stew Gorak had been cooking up since they had landed on Akkato. Davis and the others were already familiar with the Bosku race. Although neither Akkato nor Aponi readily admitted to working with the lizards, there was no alternative when there was dirty work to be done. The Bosku were not all bad as a people. There were great artists, scholars, and scientists among them, but they were the exception rather than the rule. It was better to keep them at arm's length, and if you belonged to the better circles, you even denied knowing of their existence. Skorsky wiped his mouth with his sleeve after he had stopped laughing. The Gothrex would have been enough for me, he said. I didn't really want to add to my list of bad acquaintances. If we're lucky, the rendezvous won't take too long, Davis replied and watched as Gorak greeted one of the Bosku. Do the Aponi know about the snakes roaming their mining world? Asked Skorsky. Davis spared himself the trouble of replying. He didn't like the Akkato's friendly way of dealing with the lizard and watched the meeting of the two with growing suspicion. He also didn't like the way the Akkato soldiers and the Bosku had formed up. Their formation looked like a police phalanx to keep a group of riders at bay. The horses' heads seemed tense and it almost seemed to him as if they suddenly saw a danger in their human comrades. Get ready for battle, Davis ordered. He was following an inner intuition rather than rational thought. Accordingly, his soldiers hesitantly complied with the order. Take up a defensive position. Now, he added, pointing his rifle at the lizards. The humans obeyed and followed his example by targeting the Bosku. Davis aimed at the lizard Gorak had been talking to. Don't let the Akkato out of your sight either. I hope you can explain that, asked Skorsky, who was also aiming at one of the lizards. Not yet. But Gorak will certainly do that in a moment. The large Akkato actually approached the humans. He looked calm and a little irritated. How am I supposed to understand that? He asked, spreading his arms. We owe them our lives. And you give orders to target them? That's what you say. To take aim, right? Yes, that's what they said. And Gorak knew that. He had learned the war and combat jargon of the humans very quickly. The Akkato tried to dispel Time and Davis's doubts, but this alarmed him even more. Stay where you are, Your Excellency, he growled at Gorak. Not a step further. Gorak folded his arms behind his back while his soldiers pointed their rifles at the humans. The Akkato was silent for a while, sniffing the smoke-filled air. How long do you think you can hold out against us? I never intended to have to find out. The gunners are still up at their posts, I assume. Aren't they, Johto? The Bosku in question bared his teeth. Yes, he hissed. Sigh still enough sigh. From the lizard's snarling, Davis concluded that they could take the humans under fire at any time. He wondered if he should say something stupid and heroic and remain stubborn. Some stupid phrase that said he would rather die fighting than surrender himself and his people. Instead, he thought about how to get out of the situation unscathed and desperately searched for words to stall for time. Gorak, meanwhile, used Davis's silence to make the people understand their situation. We have no intention of killing you, he said. On the contrary. But I want you to hand in your weapons now. Davis licked his dry lips. And then what happens? Nothing. But I know your fearful nature and I don't want there to be any problems with the Bosku. You know how quickly bloodshed can occur when weapons are already pointed at the enemy. Skorsky moved a little closer to Davis. I don't like it when you're right, you pessimist. But don't do anything now that would make the Lohengrin in you. I'm not in the mood for a heroic death. Gorak walked at a leisurely pace towards Davis. The guardsmen's rifles were aimed at him and the muzzles followed his every move. When he reached the two humans, he bent down to Davis. Listen to your friend, he breathed, so that only Davis and Skorsky could hear him. Don't do anything you'll regret for the rest of your life. I need you. You and your buddy. Think about your next steps. Are you trying to kill my squad? Davis also whispered. They saved your lives. They shall not die, Gorak replied in surprise and with a look of contempt, as if Davis had made an offensive remark. They will serve me. For all eternity. And they will do so in a way that offers them far more opportunities than they have had so far. Davis had no idea what Gorak was talking about. I don't understand what you're trying to tell me. The Gothrex, Gorak revealed to Mestre. They are our new weapon. A hybrid of an enhanced Kimon body with the genetics of the best human fighters, along with their ability to track the Skelks. We've cleaned up after you on your many missions. We collected the dying and wounded when we had the chance and helped them to a new existence. A rebirth. You saw many of your former comrades again on the battlefield in the final hours. And they saved all our lives. You should be grateful to me for all that. Davis looked over at the Bosku. He remembered another repulsive detail that the Bosku were known for. It involved genetic experiments. Allegedly, they did business with various organizations on Earth and the merchandise consisted of humans. Allegedly, the experiments were one reason why the Bosku had been deprived of their home world and condemned to a nomadic life among the stars. I can't let you do this, came from Davis's compressed lips. You've already made up your mind, said Gorak. I can read your mind. You're no hero to sacrifice yourself for others. Order them to lower their weapons and go with the Bosku. I have other, greater tasks for you too. Davis cursed himself. Cursed himself for not having the strength and idealism of the Grail Knight Skorsky had mentioned and for ordering him to open fire on Akkato and Bosku. A last stand. Not desperate. Rather angry and defiant, like the Battle of the Burgundians at Etzel's court in the Song of the Nibelungs. But Davis was not a knight from one of the romantic sagas. It was strange how deep the gulf was between admiring his heroes and imitating them. He clung to his life and that made him weak. Lower your weapons, he ordered, looking into Akkato's satisfied face. The people obeyed, but Davis could see the helplessness on their faces. A bitter sight that would haunt him for a long time to come. Gorak had a few words for Davis and Skorsky. I read a book, he said. A story that is very important to your culture. Revealing. A psychogram. The Catcher in the Rye, if I remember correctly. Haunting and tiring at the same time. I don't know how many times I had to start again from the beginning. But the more I waded through it, the deeper my insights into the true nature of human beings became. People are nomads, wandering through desolate lands. They struggle through misfortunes and problems that they often cause themselves. Which they then regret, only to commit them all over again. They need this in order not to fall back into the darkness of their past. At least to preserve the illusion of having escaped the dark days in their caves. Davis was all ears. It was strangely fascinating to be enlightened by a horse-headed alien about the structures of the human mind and various literary tidbits it had assimilated. Isn't it also good for you to know, Gorak continued, that it is possible for some extraordinary individuals to escape the madness that has afflicted your world? To have the opportunity to create something great and lasting. To turn your back on a dying race of troglodytes and escape the darkness of prehistory? Davis was fascinated by the Akkato's accent-free and selective expression. The Akkato had a sense for languages and Gorak was very talented. His delivery had something of the hypnotic sing-song Davis used to try and drive the skelks out of his head. But whether he liked it or not, it was pleasant to hear Akkato's words and use them as an excuse for his cowardice. "Bring me capable people." Gorak's words sounded like an order. Help them escape the chaos and accomplish something great. Something that will stand the test of time. They will thank you forever. You will be their savior and their god. Davis searched desperately for arguments, wanted to hurl curses at Akkato's head. To tell him how criminal his plan was, how inhuman and ungrateful. But his thoughts only revolved around the vague hope that Gorak's offer contained. He could now fight a battle that would kill them all or take the hand of Akkato. Secure a future for the humans by gambling that some of the individuals he brought to the Akkato would manage to escape to other worlds. Humans always found a way in the end if you opened a door for them first, and Davis didn't have to do more than enter into the bargain. He cursed himself for it, because at the back of his mind was the realization that he was only deceiving himself with his arguments. Perhaps he was just looking for excuses to save his own skin. He secured his rifle and shouldered it. "Go with the Bosku," he ordered. "It's all right." The soldiers reluctantly obeyed the order. They reluctantly laid their weapons on the ground and followed the lizards inside the station. "I will have you brought back to Earth," Gorak finally continued. "There you will meet someone with whom you can discuss what to do next. I'm counting on you not to let me down." With that, he turned away and went after the humans, who looked to Davis like a herd of cattle disappearing inside the station. Skorsky cleared his throat. "That didn't go the way we wanted it to, buddy. I'm not as well-read as our horse-headed friend, but I've seen a few old horror movies that aren't without their problems." Davis was in no mood to solve puzzles. "Get to the point. Are we Frankenstein's body snatchers now?" Skorsky replied. "Who infiltrate cemeteries at night and provide him with bodies for his experiments." The words hit home. Davis searched for a suitable retort, but he felt too bad to argue with his friend now. He felt sick when he thought of what might happen to his soldiers, and yet he had gone along with it. At that moment, he would have preferred to have chosen to fight and now lie dead on the ground without a thought. Would that have been the easier way? Or merely the choice of a fool who was incapable of thinking pragmatically? The choice of an idealist, a Lohengrin. Ideals are only nobler errors, he had once heard. There was no point in dying for an error. Well... Skorsky exhaled audibly, startling Davis out of his musings. "It's legitimate to do anything to save your own skin." He shouldered his rifle and stared into space. "For my part, I'm going to play the good game for as long as I can." Chapter 2. Davis and Skorsky both felt uncomfortable in the presence of the Bosku. Even their first encounter in the square in front of the bunker had been unpleasant. The unsettling grin of their sharp teeth behind their half-open mouths and the sight of their tongues sticking out and occasionally licking their lips gave Davis the creeps. Now being crammed into their cramped ship with the Bosku made the situation almost unbearable for him. The vehicle consisted only of a cockpit, in which the two lizard creatures sat, in a room full of crates and equipment, between which the two humans had made themselves reasonably comfortable. The interstellar flight lasted a good 15 hours before the ship slowed down and entered the Earth's solar system. It flew past Neptune, Uranus, Saturn and Jupiter, which took another hour before Mars came into view. Davis watched the course the spacecraft took and saw a structure resembling a spaceport come into view in the rust-colored wasteland of the desert planet. The buildings made a neglected and dilapidated impression. Several buildings were covered by huge sand dunes and could only be recognized by the geometric shapes that stood out vaguely under the red dust. The large dome, which was ajar and towards which the Bosku were heading, was conspicuous. The lizards chased their ship into the interior of the dome as if it were a projectile, only firing their counter-thrusters at the last moment. Davis and Skorsky were thrown back and forth between the crates and containers in the cargo hold. Skorsky cursed and cursed the Bosku. They just laughed, which sounded like hissing, and bared their pointed teeth. Finally, the ship touched down and the two pilots peeled themselves out of their seats. "Mitm" came from the mouth of one of the Bosku. "Jit Minratet." Davis and Skorsky shouldered their rifles and picked up their packs before stepping through the open bulkhead with the two lizards. They found themselves in a huge, sparsely lit hall in which masses of different freight containers were piled up. The sunlight only shone in through the narrow gap, leaving much in the dark. But it could be assumed that the mass of containers continued into the shadows. Davis thought he could make out the outline of a large van at the back of the hall. Whoever was doing business here was doing it on a grand scale. Smugglers, Skorsky remarked. Or worse, Davis added in amazement. A voice echoed through the twilight. It is not proper to insult your host. A figure emerged from the shadows. A man wearing a black suit reminiscent of an old-fashioned frock coat. He was lean, not particularly tall, and had a narrow, pale face with the typical red lips that indicated the consumption of purple poppies. So you are the ambassadors of Akkato, the thin man continued. Davis saw one of the Bosku hand the man a data card, which the pale-faced man touched with his fingertips for a while. Davis suspected that it contained secret information in some kind of braille. Ambassador would be too much to say, Davis replied. And besides, we only speak for one Akkato, not for the whole race. The man put the card in the inside pocket of his suit. Bounty hunter might be a better term. They had never been called bounty hunters. They were never paid to kidnap people. There was never a bounty. My name is Raymond Davis and my companion is Pavel Skorsky, he introduces himself and his friend. They call me the Jet Man. I represent the Mandarin, who owns everything you see here and much more on Mars. I am his Chamberlain and will take you to him. But I need to know a few things about you both first. Davis had expected this, of course, but now that the time had come, he felt uneasy. It was always difficult to tell what expectations a negotiating partner had. Especially when the agreements had gone through a third party. Davis didn't know what information had been passed on and what image the Jet Man had formed. Go ahead, he urged the Jet Man. We have nothing to hide. A bold statement, if I may be so honest, said Davis, trying to smile. The Jet Man seemed amused for a moment. Were you both soldiers? No. Police? No. The answer came a split second too late. But something similar. What was it? Border guards. We brought illegal immigrants back to their home country. At which border? Wherever we were needed. Mercenaries? No. The way you say that, you strike me as someone who doesn't want to be associated with criminal activities. Or with scum like us. Davis didn't say anything back. So how come you want to get involved in our business? I mean, what are your superiors thinking? Don't they realize what a dilemma this could create for them? Our motives are our business. The Jet Man shook his head. I'm afraid it doesn't work like that. If working with you turns out to be a mistake, it will ultimately fall back on me. So far, I've been spared the experience of feeling like a failure. All the business contacts I have been able to establish have proved to be useful and profitable. I don't want to have anything to blame myself for with you either. Davis turned briefly to Skorsky, who did not take his eyes off the Jet Man and pressed his lips together tensely. Skorsky always lost his tongue when there was trouble and he got nervous. So, continued the pale fellow in his black frock coat, what finally threw the noble knight out of the saddle and down into the dirt? Nothing, Davis replied. The knight is just doing his duty. And I do not question the intentions and motives that move Gorak of House Mestre. I do not presume to be able to judge things better than he does or what he intends to do. Dirt can be annoying or useful. Sometimes you scatter shit on the field, and sometimes you scrape it off your boot. Gorak judges which is the case. And I'm not going to contradict him. The Jet Man watched every movement on the faces of the two men. It was an eternity before he addressed them again. So you are nothing more than loyal servants who carry out orders. Is it different for you? The Jet Man paused for a moment and nodded with a smile before becoming serious again. No personal ambitions at all? Only when it comes to the quality of our work. Too thick, Davis reprimanded himself. I would have been better off biting my tongue than spouting such nonsense. Good to know, said the Jetman, who obviously liked Davis's answer. People with ambitions only cause problems. You have to keep an eye on them all the time. I think we'll get along fine. Chapter 3. The journey to the Mandarin's domicile involved several exhausting detours. Apparently, this was done to cover their tracks and keep the existence of the old spaceport a secret. They then made their way through the narrow, winding streets of Brooklyn, one of the largest Mars colonies. It had developed from a shanty town into a real city, if you were prepared to neglect earthly standards of architecture and design. The large houses were nothing more than containers stacked on top of each other, with stylistic plastic decorations added in some places. Here and there, it peeled away from the walls and exposed the cables and pipes underneath. There was no hiding the fact that the colony had been created out of sober, unadorned practicality and was not intended to please the eye of the settlers. On the contrary, the more the inhabitants tried to conceal this fact, the more it became apparent. The cheap material they used was no match for the planet's adverse climate and quickly weathered away. However, without developing the burlesque charm that the facades of earthly cities possessed as they decayed. Added to this was the disgusting smell of rotten eggs that hung over the entire planet and seemed to intensify in the streets of Brooklyn. The place where the Mandarin was staying, on the other hand, was the complete opposite of the rundown look of the city. After Davis and Skorsky had crossed a shabby alleyway and passed a rusty bulkhead at the end, they were greeted by the sound of sensual music wafting through your long corridor. Davis and Skorsky followed the Jetman into a large room filled with subdued lighting that conveyed the mood of a tropical twilight. He caught the scent of different drugs. The heavy sweetness of the suma plant. The tart aroma of the synthetic axin crystals and the sharp lemon scent of saya resin. On a gallery covered with cushions and precious fabrics, a fat man sat smoking a hookah. Dressed in an ancient, colorful robe with playful patterns and lavish embroidery, he made a strange and foppish impression. Davis couldn't help but think of a harlequin and did his best to suppress a laugh. At the man's feet were 5 women in skin-tight, shiny costumes, who looked attentively at the new arrivals. Davis saw other people sitting in the shadowy booths of the hall, chatting or engrossed in card games. Raymond Davis and Pavel Skorsky, the Jetman, introduced his 2 companions. They are to train our people in effective hunting. There had never been any talk of them joining forces with others. Davis had to summon up all his strength to keep his anger from showing. It was obviously additional information that the Jetman had been able to glean from the map he had received from the Bosku. Davis called himself a fool. How could he assume that Gorak would just let him return to Earth after he had seen what happened to the people who fought for the prince's son? The Mandarin's people would keep a watchful eye on their 2 guests and make sure they did their duty, whatever it might be. The Mandarin let out a few curls of smoke that rose from between his bulging lips and put aside the data pad he had just been typing on. So there, he said, looking at his guests long and hard. What can they do that our people can't do in the same way? First and foremost, they are the ones the Akkato trust, replied the Jetman. Davis and Skorsky will see for themselves that we work reliably and conscientiously. Why does the Akkato care? The Mandarin sat up, which turned into a procedure that took a few moments. We deliver and they pay. If they don't like the goods, they don't have to buy them. Davis got the impression that the whole thing was based on the Jetman's idea. The Mandarin still seemed skeptical about the deal. At least it looked as if the Mandarin was not privy to all the details and had major reservations. We can avoid this waste of time in future, replied the Jetman. Managing returned goods has also become very costly. With Davis and Skorsky, we have the opportunity to avoid such circumstances from the outset. In addition, the Akkato do not know all aspects of the human condition and could simply overlook indications of mental disorders. Davis and Skorsky will ensure that everything is in order with future deliveries. In this case, we would be on the outside if any defects were to occur. This argument seemed to make sense to the Mandarin. The Akkato are concerned with special goods, added the treasurer. Something that our competitors find difficult to supply, as their approach does not include any explicit harvesting precautions. Above all, the Akkato want fighters. Strong, cunning, clever and unharmed. Why? The fat guy wondered. Do they taste better? The pale man in his old-fashioned black suit dared to smile. The goods won't end up in the Bosku's cooking pots. Gorak needs them for a special breeding program. A sex thing, then. The Mandarin laughed, which sounded like a belch, and popped a bunch of grapes into his mouth, which he fished out of a large bowl of fruit. That sounds exciting. Our 2 helpers are there to make sure that no damage is done during the hunt. Our people's methods are indeed too brutal, but that's no big secret. The Harlequin stirred the air with his fleshy fingers as if he were trying to shoo away a few flies. And those 2 are better at it. The jet man signaled that it was Davis's turn to convince the Mandarin and stepped aside. Davis didn't know where to start at first, but found his voice again after 2 or 3 seconds. We have caught illegal border crossers in the past. We have experience in finding people and returning them to their home country. So you're not squeamish. The Mandarin pretended to hold an invisible gun in his hands and take aim at an imaginary target. Bang! Then he laughed again. So far, we have managed to avoid killing or seriously injuring anyone. Why such circumstances? Isn't it easier? The clown repeated the gesture. PSH. Insurance reasons, Skorsky interjected. Border crossers do not commit a crime per se, according to international law. It is therefore not legal to shoot them or cause them harm. Indeed. The Mandarin rubbed his chin. I notice our points of view differ considerably. He gave his Chamberlain an appreciative look. People of mind in this business. Who would have thought it? Davis's stomach turned when he thought of the crimes the Fleds had already committed. Crimes that no one wanted to admit or tolerated. There were certainly elements in the remaining governments of the solar system who were doing business with the Fleds and covering up their activities. The oft-invoked notion that humans would come together as a cohesive unit in the face of the threat from alien races had been consigned to the realm of fairy tales. Instead of coming together, humanity had fragmented into small nation-states. People mistrusted each other and hardly worked together. The resulting freedom provided a breeding ground for all kinds of criminal organizations. Smugglers, mercenaries and Fleds who regarded their fellow human beings as true. How can I imagine your work? The Mandarin asked. You just set off and pick off unwary hikers? Something like that. That will change. The Mandarin's clumsily confidential tone suddenly took on a harsh tone. You too will join a harvesting group and adapt to our ways. If we can learn anything from you, I will welcome it, but I have no intention of trying out new methods as long as the old ones prove their worth. Davis had no objections to this. I've never considered it our job to teach your people anything. So we'll accompany them and make a selection from the spoils. The Mandarin reached for the mouthpiece of his water pipe, which was standing next to the divan. He took a few puffs and exhaled a few curls of smoke. You grab the fillets and make sure they stay intact. And Gorak will pay well for it, Davis added. The jetman felt compelled to add a piece of information to the conversation. 3 times what the Kimon have to offer in diamonds or gold. In Davis's eyes, the Mandarin looked like the caterpillar lolling on the umbrella of a mushroom in the story of Alice in Wonderland. He took a few puffs on his pipe and thought about it. If this involves fighters, he said after a while, who are to be incorporated into the Akkato military, the Kimon won't like it. They might see me as a threat. Davis shrugged his shoulders briefly. The bugs don't need to know about this. And who guarantees me that? You are a successful businessman, Davis continued. You know that every new step is a risk. But you wouldn't be where you are now if you were afraid of it. The Mandarin pointed his mouthpiece at Davis and didn't say a word for a few moments. His expression and gesture were difficult to interpret, but Davis thought he had annoyed the fat man with his last remark. Then the Mandarin and his Chamberlain exchanged a few glances. We'll keep a watchful eye on our new employees, reassured the jetman, who could tell that this meeting was not going in the direction he had in mind. But from what I've learned, we're lucky to have men like Davis and Skorsky with us. Lately, there has been merchandise that has resisted. We've had to kill or injure them and we've had casualties. Crew and loot. But I emphasize it again. The Akkato seem to be concerned precisely with these dangerous specimens. It would be desirable to take over this variety without harm, which is what the horseheads are after. Time-consuming, the Mandarin interjected. If we have to be careful not to harm the goods, we'll only lose time. I think I can do without the services of the two of them. Davis had to use a ruse to get his head out of the noose. Gorak is prepared to pay very well and wants to give you a taste of his generosity. Davis pulled out a narrow tube of polished black wood and handed it to the Mandarin. At that moment, 3 women emerged from the semi-darkness surrounding the divan on which the Mandarin was seated. Slender, athletic women, dressed in tight, colorful leotards, who at first glance looked like dancers. Davis recognized immediately that the 3 of them were not to be trifled with. They didn't appear to have weapons, but it was safe to assume that the opposite was true. Dracula's daughters, it flashed through his mind as they leapt out of the darkness so suddenly. Seductive and deadly. The Mandarin raised his hand. The 3 women paused in their movements and relaxed, but did not look away from Davis. The Mandarin then motioned for Davis to come closer and took the tube. He opened the golden cap and let about a dozen white, polished diamonds slide into his palm. The jet man tried to look indifferent, but for a moment he sucked in his breath in surprise. The sight seemed to take his breath away. His boss also found it difficult to feign composure. "Good," he said, licking his bulging lips. "Our 2 new fighters will be taken to Earth. One of our Griffin groups will be waiting for them there. I will instruct them not to cause them any problems and to be open to their advice." Chapter 4. A certain Alexander Brest was waiting for Davis and Skorsky, who were taken by the jetman to one of Brooklyn's small spaceports, which consisted of nothing more than a concrete field and a few poor tin shacks. Together with Brest, they boarded a ship barely larger than an orbital shuttle that had already seen its best days. The jetman shared some more information with his new business partners. "You will be joining a group under the command of Grigory Kolensky. He commands a crew of 12 men. Does Kolensky have a permanent base?" Davis wanted to know. "It's mobile, like most units," explained the jetman. "But it has claim to a considerable area on Earth. We always know where something has just happened in the solar system. Battles, accidents. When we hear about it, we send a squad that is closest to the action or has a fast ship. The people waiting there for help are usually not suspicious and are easy prey, provided they don't start to fight back or run away. This often results in damage to the goods. But if you're with us now, we'll probably take a more targeted approach and look for prey where we don't have to wait for something to happen. And where we hardly have any problems. Why haven't you done this before? I mean, the targeted hunting? In a disaster situation, it's easier to cover your tracks. Rescue units don't start chasing crooks when people's lives are at stake and usually don't chase us when we've harvested. It's been the easier way so far." So far, Davis repeated in his mind. If he put everything he had heard so far into a logical context, the humans no longer thought the threat of the Fleds was one of those dark legends that people told themselves in order to feel a little creepy. The prey now seemed prepared for the appearance of these vultures and had learned to fight back. Brest prepared the ship for takeoff. The engines ignited without thrust and the entire hull began to vibrate. "It will take us about 20 hours to reach Earth," Brest informed them. "Kolensky knows we're coming?" The jetman nodded and then turned to Davis and Skorsky. "Here's to a good and smooth collaboration. I wish you luck." With these words, he left the ship. Meanwhile, Skorsky watched as Brest prepared for takeoff. The cockpit was cramped and only had room for 1 pilot. For the 2 passengers, this meant sitting on the emergency seats in the cargo area. The seat shells and backrests were made of hard plastic and the seat cushions, which did not deserve to be called that, were worn and worn through. This would be another unpleasant trip, like the one they had made with the Bosku. The rough start and the bumpy flight through the turbulent Martian atmosphere was a fitting overture to the ordeal that followed. Skorsky again hadn't spoken a word since they had boarded, and Davis involuntarily wondered what was worrying his friend at the moment. But before he could address him, Skorsky rose from his seat and came over to Davis, who was sitting opposite him. "What is it?" asked Davis. Skorsky peered cautiously into the cockpit. "I know this type of vehicle," he said so quietly that he could barely be heard over the hum of the drive and the ship's systems. "It's much faster than Brest claims, and the ship is in good condition. You think he's planning to take a detour?" "He has planned a stopover. I'm sure of it." "Why would he do that?" "How should I know that?" "Wait and see." "Let me do it." "Okay." Skorsky sat down again and fell back into a frowning silence. He kept studying the displays on the console as best he could and stared out of the window as if he feared that the devil himself might appear at any moment and snatch them from the sky. Every now and then, Brest left the cockpit to check or rearrange something in the cargo hold. He looked at lists and the cargo labels on various containers, checked several times that the cargo was properly anchored, and made entries in his data pad. "I'm sure you have exciting stories to tell," Brest remarked. "We've got plenty of time, and I'd be very interested to hear one of them." "It must be quite exciting to get to know new worlds." Skorsky gave no answer. His face revealed that he had no desire to enter into a conversation with Brest. "Seems like word is spreading fast about where we're from," said Davis, who found it useful to nip any emerging tensions in the bud with a little chit-chat. "The fact that returnees have arrived will quickly make the rounds and cause a stir." "Don't worry," Brest reassured him. "It will remain secret. Only the Mandarin, the Jetman, and I know about it. Kolensky's squad doesn't have a clue either." "Not to mention the dancers," Skorsky interjected. "They noticed everything." Brest paused for a moment too long. "The Mandarin's bodyguards are loyal," he claimed. "I have no qualms about that. I want your confidence." Skorsky looked at the pilot. "And what about you? You're just an errand boy, aren't you? You've been told, too. Or do you have a keen nose for secrets?" "My tasks are varied," replied Brest. Davis leaned forward and propped his elbows on his knees, like someone ready to engage in casual conversation. "What would you like to know?" Brest didn't seem to think of anything at first. He obviously didn't know exactly what he could have asked. "What are the new worlds like?" "No different than the ones we're losing right now," Davis replied. "Or that we started to lose when we crawled out of our caves and discovered civilization," Skorsky added cryptically. Brest nodded understandingly. "So it's not worth it. And it's better to stick to our fireplaces." Davis laughed. Sometimes it wasn't so easy to follow Skorsky when he coughed up one of his meaningful remarks, but Brest had gotten the idea. "I wouldn't say that. After all, you get to see the most magnificent sights before you're shot to pieces or torn apart by a Kimon." "I've heard there's a refuge for humans," Brest asked abruptly. "A kind of paradise where we could live without being afraid." "There is always fear. Fear is a reality." "Well, I've just heard it. It's a rumor they tell." "From whom?" "That was in a bar on the Catalonia habitat. Mining region near the Ceres protoplanet." "Mate talk," Skorsky interjected. "Anyone who works underground or far from the sun always wishes they were in a better place." "There was a name," Brest said sharply, not liking Skorsky's tone. "Archer was the name of the guy who was there." "And where is he now?" Davis wanted to know. "Gone. In hiding. Or back there again." Skorsky grunted an imprecation. "All this chatter turns your brain to mush. Don't delude yourself. There's no peace between the stars. Or do you think we would have come back otherwise?" Serious mistake, Davis thought, but before he could play it off, Brest had already drawn his conclusions. Involuntarily, the pilot's hand went to the holster on his belt. "I thought your boss sent you here to work with us. But you're trying to get away. Take it easy." Davis couldn't stop the sweat from breaking out on his forehead. "That's an option, of course. I'd be lying if that hadn't crossed our minds." Brest fell silent. He couldn't tell how much this new situation was unsettling him, but he was certainly thinking about how to deal with it. The suspicion was now in the air. It would determine the next few seconds and give the whole venture a new direction. Why did they switch off the proximity alarm? Skorsky wanted to know. Brest looked briefly at the console in the cockpit. You're familiar with ships like this? I was a mechanic, Skorsky replies. And I get the impression that you're not being honest with us. And not to your boss either. Davis watched the pilot very closely and was prepared for him to draw his weapon at any moment. Since they assumed we were on the Mandarin's side, Davis concluded, I assumed that he wouldn't agree to a stopover. Or at least wouldn't be aware of it. That's why you didn't say anything about an unexpected rendezvous that would justify the long journey. Am I right in assuming that? At that moment, Skorsky pulled a small needle thrower from the inside pocket of his left sleeve. It was so tiny that it almost disappeared into the palm of his large hand. All right. Brest groaned, raising his hands and taking a step or two back. Nothing is good, growled Skorsky, rising and holding the muzzle of the small weapon directly in front of the stunned pilot's face. We're on the same side, Brest hastened to assure him. You don't even know which side we're on. On the side of those who want to have a clear conscience. Skorsky laughed bitterly. A clear conscience? Show me someone who claims to have one and I'll show you a dead man. Davis raised his hands reassuringly and looked the pilot over from head to toe. I don't think his statement is so bad. That makes him very likable. But who from the League of Idealists with a clean record are you about to introduce to us? Skorsky went into the cockpit without taking his eyes off Brest and switched on the proximity alarm. Immediately afterwards, a few warning signals howled. A marker began to pulse on the navigation monitor. An unknown ship, Skorsky informed his friend. Pretty big pot. Military. So you're a fleet spy, Davis concluded. No, contradicted the pilot. I was never in the military. Private security services. And who are your buddies? The ship is the Athena and the captain's name is Arthur Blake. Why are you in contact with the fleet? Brest pinched his lips together. He looked like someone who had more lies and deceptions to hide. Blake no longer works for the fleet. He's gone into business for himself because he hardly trusts anyone who wears a uniform anymore. And why is that? The Fleds have infiltrated the fleet and Blake is trying to put a stop to them in his own way. He has connections and an enormous knowledge of all the military structures left to Earth's governments and knows who is in cahoots with the criminals. Skorsky seemed to like these revelations. In any case, he lowered the Nadler. Your stories are just as exciting as the ones you wanted to hear from us. But they're strong accusations. Blake has to be able to prove all this if he wants to make a difference. He's looking for evidence. But for it to be of any use, it has to be high-ranking officers that he can piss on. And you have to be able to prove that they have built up a network involving the trade in human flesh. Good to know. Davis stood up and looked at the console and the many monitors on it. But we'll avoid meeting her secret boss for the time being. I'm sure he has work for you, Brest hastened to say. You can only win and do the right thing. We're about to do the right thing, Skorsky said. That's why we're still alive. We want it to stay that way. You're making a big mistake. Many people have already said that to us and we can dance on their graves. Davis now pulled his pistol from his holster and pushed the pilot further back into the cargo hold. Pavel, would you be so kind as to take us home? Direct course, please. Give the Athena a wide berth and make sure she can't follow us. Skorsky didn't waste a second and got behind the wheel. It will be difficult, he said and increased the thrust of the engines. But I can see some values that allow conclusions to be drawn about illegal tuning. Davis looked at Brest questioningly while Skorsky informed him that the Athena was about to set an intercept course. We can get away from her friends, can't we? Naturally, Brest thought about how he could make the two men realize that contact with Blake would only be to their advantage. If you would just listen to Blake for a few minutes, he might be able to change your mind. That's what I'm afraid of, said Davis. I've had enough of the adventures and their ideals. So, Skorsky urged the pilot. Where's the power supply line for the booster? Chapter 5. Brest was tied up with a few cables and sat on the floor in front of the cockpit bulkhead. Skorsky had succeeded in detaching the Athena and was just passing the moon's orbit. The dark half of the gray satellite was dotted with the lights of countless settlements connected by a dense road system. It covered the Earth's satellite like a tightly woven net, in fine, bright lines. Davis noticed that the lights of several colonies had gone out in the meantime. He recognized craters and impact holes where either bombardments had fallen or spaceships had crashed. He couldn't make out any wreckage. Akkato and Kimon carefully salvaged their wrecked ships to prevent the humans from taking them and exploring them. However, Davis was certain that this would not work in the long term. The invaders did not have to fear the humans because of this. The Earthlings would certainly turn the weapons they had developed against each other in order to rebuild their old empires instead of reclaiming their freedom in a battle against the aliens. How do we want to proceed? Asked Skorsky. Do we steal the ship and throw Brest out somewhere? Davis watched Brest's reaction, but he remained very calm. We're not going to steal his ship. And he should return to the Mandarin. Why? Skorsky wanted to know. He could betray us. Too dangerous for him, Davis replied. We know he's a traitor. And he'll do the devil to risk the Mandarin sending someone after us who we could tell about it. Skorsky was more than irritated. You mean we just get out and let him fly away? Not that either. Davis sat down in his seat and cradled his pistol in his hand. We won't be able to avoid fighting. If he tells the Mandarin we overpowered him and then fled, they'll ask why he didn't go with this one squad. Kolensky, Skorsky reminded him. Shame on my fellow countrymen. People will ask Brest why he didn't take up the pursuit immediately. Brest seemed uncomfortable with these considerations. Do you want to take on the Fleds? The Griffin troops are made up of hardened people. You're going to lose. We have the element of surprise on our side, Davis said. And we have no other choice, if we want to keep you alive so that you can continue to conspire against the Mandarin, which I very much welcome, and if we want to prevent a squad of assassins from stalking us while we're alive. Skorsky muttered a curse. The plan sounds like suicide. I have to agree with Brest. Davis knew only too well how dangerous their situation was. The easiest thing to do was to kill Brest and simply disappear with the ship. But he didn't want to return to Earth and become a murderer. We'll do as I say. Brest had further objections. There are 12 men under Kolensky's command. Damned capable people. All the more reason to switch them off. They won't let themselves be overwhelmed that easily. Tell me something I don't know. The transporter plunged into the uppermost layers of the Earth's atmosphere. The ship's hull began to crunch. Skorsky ignited the deceleration engines and increased the energy of the reflector fields. The landing point marker appeared on the monitor. A wooded area in the north of Montana. Skorsky logged in the coordinates and rose from the pilot's chair. Now you should take over again, Brest. Davis cut the pilot's restraints, helped him up and pushed him into the cockpit. No funny business, Skorsky warned. I'll keep an eye on you. I support your plan. Brest opened the communication channel. It could work and seems to be the only option I have left. He called Kolensky's troop and received an answer after a few seconds. Are the Wonder Boys on board? The voice sounded impatient and brash. Yes, they're with me, Brest replied. What's your impression? I can't judge yet. I hope they're not smart Alecs who want to tell me how to do my job. Don't worry. They don't talk much. With that, Kolensky ended the contact, which Davis didn't like at all. We don't know how many are expecting us. Whether it's the whole squad or whether there are others. Brest switched on some sensors and received an image of the landing site's surroundings on the main monitor. You could see a bunch of red spots that gradually disappeared until there were only about 8 or 10 of them left. These are Kolensky's people, explained Brest. I assume the rest are in the glider. I think he's there with all his people. He fiddled with a few switches and the shape of a vehicle emerged from a tangle of lines and splashes of color. A small converted torpedo boat, for a crew of 30, with enlarged engines. Made to strike and disappear as quickly as possible. It was standing in a clearing. The sun had just set and the forest shrouded the meadow in its blue shadow. Skorsky had already thought about what to do next. We have to clean this thing up. There's no way around it. But not before landing. And not immediately afterwards either. Davis didn't want those standing outside the boat to scramble, which would certainly happen if they opened fire. Land so that we can fire into the interior with the guns. Right through the front bulkhead. What's that cannon you have under the cockpit? A Schneiderkampf. From the way Brest said it, he didn't seem to think much of the weapon. Fires 20mm explosive rounds. Rate of fire is 2 rounds per second. Not very effective for hitting multiple moving targets. That should be quite enough to damage the boat and keep the crew at bay. We'll have to take Kolensky and his men on the outside in close combat. I only have this one gun, Brest pointed out. I'll have to land a few good hits before they can close the bulkhead and catch several lines so that the crew can't return fire. Or prefer to abandon ship. We go out first, Davis explained, exchange a few words, and then we open fire. I'll start the attack when I think it's convenient. We'll take out as many of them as we can. Then back into the ship and empty the whole magazine into the torpedo boat. Brest concentrated on the landing and set the ship down exactly as they had discussed. The engines fell silent. The Fleds stood in front of their torpedo boat, spread out in the tall grass. They were all armed. Skorsky had fallen silent again and had this concentrated look on his face, as if the battle was already going on in his head in every detail. Davis knew he would be able to rely completely on his comrade, who had always proved reliable in all previous battles. Brest opened the bulkhead and walked down the 2 steps of the ladder under the escape hatch. Davis and Skorsky followed. They walked a short distance behind the pilot through the tall grass until Brest stood directly in front of Kolensky. The fled troop remained in place. Only 2 of them moved a little further away, ready to tackle the new arrivals should anything unexpected happen. Davis would have done the same and included this step in his considerations. So these are the guys, Kolensky began, without greeting Brest. And they're supposed to be useful to us. Kolensky looked exactly like the leader of a mercenary troop. Tall, athletic, bald with a Maori tattoo covering the right half of his angular face. In his hands he held a short-barreled rifle. An assortment of knives and a crude machete hung from his belt. They will have to prove to you whether they are useful, Brest replied. My part of the job is done. I'm flying off again. You will wait until I have decided to include her in my troop. Brest thought for a moment before answering. All right. He turned away and stood behind Davis and Skorsky. So. He made a welcoming gesture with his hand. Begin your interview. Davis wasn't entirely comfortable having Brest at his back. If he didn't stick to the plan, he'd shoot him first and tell the Fleds he was a traitor. Actually a good gift to the Fleds, when he thought about it. Helpful to build trust and put himself in a favorable light. Kolensky didn't bat an eyelid. So. What are you supposed to teach me that I don't already know? It's hard to say at the moment, Davis replied. You'll know more after a few days in the field. Who said it would come to this? I assume that the Mandarin assumes that. He also doesn't have to pay the costs and delays that I have to put up with when things go wrong somewhere. You can be sure that your boss has made a very profitable deal and can handle a few expenses. I assume so, he's a businessman and that's his job. Kolensky turned his attention to Brest. Have you gotten a raise yet? Or the prospect of more percentages on your commissions? Brest shrugged his shoulders. I'm happy as it is. Kolensky laughed, showing a pair of flashing gold teeth. Grocers and sheep. He spat out. We are wolves. We have no desire to be content or rest. No predator would be foolish enough to take a day's rest or be self-sufficient. Davis could only agree. It was impossible for him to remember a single day in the last few years when he could have rested. I agree. Oh. Do you? Kolensky took a step closer and pierced Davis with his bright blue eyes. All right, then. I'll go along with the deal. But if you and your buddy turn out to be a liability, that's it for the collaboration. Davis expected Skorsky, who was standing next to him, to make a cynical comment, but he remained silent as the grave. We won't let you down. Kolensky watched as his men lined up behind Davis and Skorsky. We'll see. With these words, the Fled stepped back a little from the two and turned away to go back on board. At that moment, Skorsky jumped forward. A knife flashed in his hand. He stabbed Kolensky 2 or 3 times in the neck, who immediately went down. Brest shot the 2 men behind Davis and Skorsky before turning and rushing back into the ship. Davis charged at him and fired a volley into Brest's back, knocking him down. The surprised Fleds barely had time to react. Skorsky killed another one with his needle thrower. The thin dart hit a woman in the cheek and the deadly poison inside took effect immediately. Davis was hit. A searing pain spread through his shoulder. He stared at a hole with glowing edges in his jacket, where a plasma charge had punched through the leather and into his body. The horrible smell of burnt flesh rose to his nose. His knees went weak. The typical shock reaction of being hit by a super-hot and almost light-speed projectile. Davis was experienced enough to deal with it, bit back the pain and ran as best he could back to the van. Panting, he reached the cockpit and dropped into the armchair. The gun was already unlocked and aimed. Without hesitation, he pulled the trigger. The glowing lances of light from the tracer bullets stabbed into the interior of the enemy boat. They chopped and pierced the walls of the torpedo boat. An explosion shook the craft. It was impossible for the pilots to aim their weapons at Skorsky without endangering their own crew. Davis saw Skorsky take fire and throw himself into the tall grass. To provide cover for his friend, Davis swung the cannon around and raked the clearing where he suspected some of the Fleds were. Skorsky seized the opportunity, crawled through the tall grass and eventually returned on board. Davis felt his strength leaving him. Why didn't you wait? I told you I'd go first. If I had done that, we'd all be dead now. You hesitated too long. He pulled Davis down from the pilot's seat and let him slide to the ground next to Brest. The pilot groaned and tried to stand up, but immediately slumped down again. Why did you do that? Skorsky asked, pulling a medipack out of a niche in the wall. Makes his story more credible, Davis explained in a dull voice. He'll survive it. Skorsky glanced out of the cockpit window and watched as the torpedo boat burst into flames. With a few presses of a button, he had raised the transporter's shield system. 5 of them got away, he said, taking off Davis's jacket. They won't come back here while their ship is on fire and could blow up. I still have to catch them before they can get together and come up with a plan. Davis disagreed. Leave them alone. They've had enough. You don't know what you're talking about. Using a pair of ceramic scissors from the medipack, he cut a hole in Davis's shirt and sprinkled a white powder on the scorched flesh. You were right. We have to get them all, otherwise Brest will go down and we'll go down with him. Call their bluff, Davis objected. They're done. Skorsky applied the needle of an injection ampoule and squeezed the soft material. Davis felt the pain fade. All sounds began to sound distant and muffled. The contours of the world blurred. There's so much money involved, Skorsky continued. The Mandarin will do everything he can to catch us. We can't leave any of the Fleds alive who think they need revenge. Brest, Davis gasped as he plunged into the darkness. I won't do anything to him, Skorsky reassured him. Otherwise we'll get into trouble with this Blake too. All Brest has to do is come up with a good story. I'll make sure he has carte blanche for that. You understand? Davis understood all too well. But Skorsky shouldn't do this alone. It was too dangerous. I'm leaving now. His words were far, far away and echoed through the darkness. No time to waste. There's knife work to be done. Chapter 6. Prologue. When Davis awoke, it was still deepest night. Inside the ship there was darkness, except for the pale glow of the monitors and control lights seeping from the cockpit. Everything was quiet and still. Only the regular breathing of the pilot, whose wounds Skorsky had also tended to, reached Davis's ears. Davis struggled to his feet and tried to peer out of the pulpit window. The fire seemed to have burned down. In any case, only a dull, reddish glow illuminated the trees that stood like a dark wall around the clearing. Davis was thirsty and hungry. He absolutely had to get something to drink and a bite between his teeth. Once he was reasonably steady on his feet again, he began to raid the supplies. It was all synthetic stuff and nothing more than pig food compared to the Akkato's military supplies, but the hunger made it seem like a feast. Davis had already filled his stomach well when the bulkhead opened again and Skorsky stepped inside the freighter. He switched on the light and stood motionless in the doorway for a moment. The image Skorsky presented was terrifying. His eyes sparkled as if a restless fire was blazing in them. His clothes shone with dried and damp blood. In his hand was the machete Davis had seen on Kolensky's belt earlier. At the gates of Zion stood the angel, Skorsky intoned an old poem. It was on the day of the slaughter that I saw him and shuddered. Down the steps he strode, his wings spread. His sword dipped in scarlet. The robe, soaked in evening red. Tired, he slid onto the seat against the wall. The machete fell from his fingers and clattered across the floor. Breast stirred and gradually dawned from his unconsciousness. What happens now? His voice was barely audible. Skorsky looked too exhausted to make a suggestion. He just sat there and stared at the floor. Davis, on the other hand, knew exactly what steps needed to be taken now. We'll fly a little to the north. Then we leave the ship and you return to the Mandarin. Make up a story. I'm sure you're good at it, otherwise you wouldn't have survived this long. Brest made no reply, got to his feet and limped into the cockpit. Do you have a specific destination? He started the engines and let the transporter hover over the treetops. Just fly north. The pilot made every effort to complete a reasonably smooth flight, but he barely succeeded. The pain and the anesthetic made it impossible for him to keep the plane steady. Davis was satisfied. If Brest intended to fire into their heels or pursue them as they fled, he would not succeed. Skorsky, who had finally come out of his stupor, gave Brest a hand when Davis gave the order to land. The transporter set down on a meadow crisscrossed by countless rivers, which spread out between two mountain flanks. The cloudless sky glowed in shades of purple as the sun rose. It climbed over a low ridge to the east and shone into the valley that meandered from there to the west. Its light caught in the flaxen tips of pampas grass that grew in the humid plain, now glowing like flames of fire. Dense deciduous forests covered the mountain flanks, which shimmered in glorious autumn colors. Some of the higher peaks were already covered in freshly fallen snow. An untouched wilderness of breathtaking beauty. In any case, Davis saw nothing to indicate human settlement. Brest injected himself with another ampoule of painkillers while his passengers ransacked the ship and filled their backpacks with everything they needed to survive in the wilderness. Don't try to follow us, Davis warned, opening the exit. I'll be glad if I don't see you again, Brest replied without hesitation. You can go to the dog's hair for all I care. Davis didn't actually want to say goodbye to Brest in bad faith. But how could you make that clear to someone who had been shot in the back just a few hours ago? I wish you all the best. To hell with you. After several hours of walking, Davis and Skorsky had made it across the swampy plain. Now they struggled through the forests that covered the mountain ridge that surrounded the valley to the west. Finally they had made it and stood at a rocky pass from which they could see far into the surrounding countryside. To the south, the mountains became lower and ran out into a wide expanse of hills that rose again to higher peaks in the distance. The majesty of the view impressed Davis. The world lay in the golden haze of fall. The air was cool, but the sun was beating down hot and still had much of the summer heat in it. At that moment, all fears and anxieties fell away from Davis. The past years, months, days and hours seemed like nothing more than a bad dream to him. He wondered why he had ever considered leaving Earth and seeking his fortune among the stars. That decision had been nothing more than a fatal mistake. No matter what problems there were and would be, this was every man's home. He was back from Oz and had no regrets about what he had had to do to get there. Betray, lie, kill, steal. He had left nothing out. "There's nowhere better than home," he whispered, enjoying the cool wind that brushed over the rocky ridge. Skorsky was still not quite himself. The events of the past few hours had left their mark, even if he was outwardly trying to be the tough, cold guy. "I don't trust peace," he finally objected. "Everything has changed. We'll have to fight for our skin even more often. Believe me. We'll never be safe again." In the distance, Davis and Skorsky could hear the roar of engines. The roar bounced back and forth from the rock walls until it faded away and fell silent. "Brest," said Skorsky. "I hope he makes something of it. All we've gained is some time. At least that's something." Davis couldn't turn away from the view that held his gaze captive. Nor did he want to deal with the possible consequences of his decision. At least not now, when the world lay so peacefully at his feet. It didn't matter which path they would have taken. None of them would have been pleasant. For Davis, the most important thing was how little he had to deny himself. "Would you have preferred it," he asked Skorsky, "if we had agreed to the deal Gorak negotiated with the Mandarin?" Skorsky shrugged his shoulders. "Depends on whether a clear conscience is useful to us in the long run. I don't know if that's enough justification for us to live as hermits until the end of our days. After all, conscience is the most changeable of all norms." Chapter 7. The days during and after the battle for Barathon dragged on. Not that Dominic wished to return to battle, but the Skeetra was not designed for human habitation, which presented certain problems. The small ships that had come from Zurak's fleet and now served as accommodation for Dominic and his comrades were lined up neatly at the back of the hangar. They were 4 fighter bombers and a transporter. All of the vehicles were damaged and did not offer any comfort designed to make the respective crew comfortable for a longer stay. Most of the problems were the sanitary systems, which were not designed to serve a crew that was on board for more than a few hours. Doc Warden complained to the Akkato, but they had other problems than taking care of people's sanitary needs. Brooks would actually have been responsible for informing the prince and taking remedial action. But the Serwan and his assistants had been missing for several days. "I'll give them a good shitting in front of the officers' quarters," Doc once said, and the next day there were indeed rumors that he had carried out his threat. Be that as it may, Dominic decided to visit the prince on the bridge and tell him about the problems. He doubted that Ulan Mestre would listen to him while the fighting was still going on, but he had to at least try. Dominic made his way to the bridge of the Skeetra, walking through the endless corridors of the ship. The journey was long and more strenuous than he had expected. He moved like a dwarf through vaults made for giants. To his consolation, the surroundings had a fascinating design, the sight of which compensated him for the drudgery. The curved shapes of the construction gave the rooms of the battleship the appearance of moving inside a hollowed-out tree. Even the prevailing smell had something of rotting autumn leaves in it. The sentries standing here and there at the mouth of a corridor or a door did not bother Dominic. They didn't even follow him with a glance to see what he was up to. Either they were that arrogant, or they simply didn't see any danger in the small, unarmed human. So he reached the command post without even having to take out the coin Ulan Mestre had given him. The bridge was huge. Dominic thought he was in a cathedral, it seemed so huge to him. A dome-shaped ceiling arched over the crew, who went about their work in small depressions in the floor. The flickering of numerous monitors and displays filled the funnel-shaped recesses, making them look like melting pits in a steelworks that Dominic had once visited with his school class. A huge hologram shone above him, showing Barathon and other worlds. Symbols and images of Akkato and Kimon units moved in the projection. the image of one of the immense Kimon claws had just gone out. Dominic's gaze fell on the impressive bridge window. It took up most of the command post and extended into the center of the dome, allowing them to see the stars above them, glittering behind the hologram. Off the bow of the Skeetraw shimmered Barathan, still fighting. Strange how these sights never lost their fascination, Dominic thought. No matter how many times you had flown over the round of a planet, you always felt like one of the gods from the ancient pantheon. And just like those gods, death and destruction followed whenever they decided to enter one of Ascaroon's many worlds. While Dominic was pondering his thoughts, he was approached by General Ito, who had come with Ulan Mestre and had placed Zurak under arrest on the Jadira. His horse's face looked grumpy. "This is not an area where you are allowed to be," he rumbled. "There's nothing here that could be of interest to you." Dominic had to stifle a laugh. Of course he wasn't allowed to be here, and that was precisely why there were certainly many things that could be interesting. The fact that Dominic had the coin apparently stopped Ito from removing him from the bridge immediately. "I just wanted to have a look at the ship," said Dominic. "I'm part of the Prince's Guard and I need to know what my surroundings look like." Ito waved 2 soldiers over. "You've seen enough. They'll take you back to your own kind." "Back to the stinking hole?" Ito ordered his soldiers to stand still. "What do you mean? Does that mean we live like in a pigsty?" "Pigs?" Ito had to think for a moment. "Ah. I see." In the meantime, Ulan Mestre had become aware of the commotion and approached. The soldiers took up their positions before Ito sent them away again. "Poda," the prince began. "What do you want here?" "Kri Kata Tarada Sunday." Ito's tone suggested that he thought the prince did not need to concern himself with the human's request. But Ulan Mestre seemed to be very interested in Porter's concerns. "What kind of problems are there?" asked the prince. "Our accommodation is not adequate," explained Dominic. "There's a lack of facilities for adequate hygiene." "Ah." Ulan Mestre nodded understandingly. "Ito will find someone who can fix it." The general looked for a moment as if he had been slapped in the face. But his irritation only lasted a moment. "I'll take care of it." Mestre put his big hand heavily on Dominic's shoulder and pushed him towards the window. "The battle is almost over," he said. "Then we'll fly home, where new tasks await you." "Otrakan?" "Yes, the most beautiful and magnificent of all worlds," the prince praised his home planet. Then he pointed to a telescope placed in front of the window. It was large and had a seat to make yourself comfortable. Mestre invited Dominic to take a seat in it. "Take a look at Barathan. It's one of our oldest worlds. A former seat of learning." Dominic certainly cut a ridiculous figure as he climbed into the large armchair like a child and tried to get the double eyepiece in front of his eyes. Once he had managed it, he saw the huge tree that had impressed him and his companions when they arrived. The enormous structure lay prostrate in the middle of the city that surrounded it. Dominic remembered the thunder and how the ground had shaken beneath his feet as the tree-like tower fell. "This is the Kadei of the House of Mestre," explained the prince. "The memory of our dynasty." Dominic let his eyes wander over the structure, which lay flat like the imprint of a stamp on the city ruins. He also noticed the deep hole that gaped in the middle of the stump and led into the depths of the planet, like a well shaft. In it, Dominic recognized structures that ran through the foundation and reached far down into the darkness. Floor by floor, they wound their way into the planet's crust. "This Kadei is ancient and full of secrets," the prince continued. "This is where our dynasty was born. The first and oldest dynasty of Akkato." Gradually, Dominic realized the interest Zurak had in this world. It was obviously part of the Akkato origin myth, and if he succeeded in reclaiming it, he would undeniably gain in prestige and influence. But in the end, his plan had failed. What's more, this had given Ulan Mestre the opportunity to rush to his son's aid and secure this success for himself. Certainly more than a humiliation for Zurak. What happens to it now? As Dominic looked at the debris spreading before his eyes, he began to doubt that the Kadei would ever be rebuilt. or the city that he had partially buried underneath him. We'll see what the Kimon have stolen. And get it back? If possible. Surely the enemies had enough time to take everything of value away from here. The prince folded his arms behind his back and made no reply. Somehow Dominic thought he had discovered an unpleasant point. What's important to us doesn't necessarily mean anything to the bugs. I want to set up a base and rebuild the Kadai. That was evasive. It could be assumed that the Kimon had already destroyed everything that seemed useless to them. So there must not be much left that was worth saving. Or was there? Were there other things besides the plant that his son had been operating in secret that held a secret? And why hadn't Mestre done everything he could to get Berathan back earlier if he was so important? In the meantime, Dominic had learned to question everything and not to trust even a supposed friend until his loyalty had been proven a few times to be genuine. We still have work to do, continued the prince. Dominic climbed out of his seat again. We're staying here on Berathan any longer? We will, confirmed Mestre. Should we get ready for battle? That won't be necessary. I will not throw myself into the fight. Planning to restore Berathan is my job now. We'll set up a few bases and then take off. The Akkato kept Dominic in the dark about when that would be. He realized that the prince's interest in Berathan had been rekindled by his son's actions. What was he trying to gain from this? Dominic had previously been under the impression that the Akkato had accepted the loss of Berathan and resigned themselves to it. Why Mestre didn't just fly away now and leave everything as it was seemed puzzling to him. I miss Serwan Brooks, Dominic said, and thought he recognized an emotion on the prince's face. The comrades are worried about where he is. He has his tasks. The prince's tone changed and Dominic realized that his questions were beginning to annoy him. I beg your pardon. It's none of my business. Over the next few hours, living containers arrived, complete with generator and processing plant, which came from the Jadira. They were placed next to the spaceships where the guardsmen had spent the last few days. Dominic moved into his quarters, which he had also used before. Now, however, Gardner's cot was also unoccupied. Dominic, Bowers, Leach and Kelman were the only survivors of living container 18A. Do you think we'll be fighting again soon? Kelman wanted to know. Dominic lay down on his mattress. How should I know? Well, at least you got us our usual beds, didn't you? Yes. I had the opportunity to talk to the prince about it. And what else? Haven't you been able to find out a bit about what's going on with us now? Anything about the Paradise Planet, for example? That would be the first thing I would want to know if I had such good contacts with Ulan Mestre. No. Dominic had long since stopped thinking about this world of refuge. Even if it existed somewhere in the vastness of Askarun, the Akkato would do the devil to take them there. In fact, it annoyed him that his comrades had rehashed the subject during the hours of idleness. I think we're more likely to get reacquainted with the Kimon still hanging around on Berathan. His comrades were all ears. Bowers swung her legs over the edge of her cot and looked at Dominic expectantly. Fresh air and a good fight are just what we're all missing. Brooks is busy with something, Dominic informed his comrades. He'll be sniffing around, Bowers remarked. He still didn't know what to make of Bowers' transformation into a fighter. It seemed to him as if a part of Stephanie's nature had passed into her. Or was it simply an addiction to mental contact with the skelks that was burning in all the guardsmen and contributing to the discord among their comrades? I suspect it has something to do with Berathan, Dominic continued. I'm sure we'll have another opportunity to prove ourselves soon. Kelman straightened up. What makes you say that? Mestre has discovered his interest in this planet. And when I mentioned Brooks, who has been leaving us for a few days now, he seemed to become uncomfortable with the subject. Why? How should I know that? But there is a connection. The whole crew is now worried. About what will happen to us and whether we are also traitors in the eyes of Akkato, like Zurak. I would ask myself the same question if I were him. So far, Mestre seemed to have treated the conspirators very moderately. In any case, no one had been interrogated and, As far as he knew, none of the Akkato officers or soldiers had been executed. That also seemed strange to Dominic. Now that he thought about it, he suspected that the conspirators, if you wanted to call them that, must have some kind of leverage against the prince. Some information that had so far prevented him from making examples. Given the effort Zurak had been able to put in, there had to be many and powerful confidants. If that was the case, the reason that had brought them together as conspirators could not be a small one. "You're worrying too much," Dominic Kelman replied, although he could just as easily have addressed the words to himself. "I'll make sure that people come to their senses and refocus on our task. The comrades have never been more sensible than they are now." Tina's remark that Brooks was certainly busy investigating did not leave his mind. It seemed likely that he was on the Jadira to interrogate the crew there. "I want the troops to line up in front of the containers in uniform and without weapons," said Dominic. "Right away." Kelman looked at Dominic in surprise. "It's just before lunch." "All the better." He seemed to have managed to give the former sportsman a stern look, because his condescending smile faded from one second to the next. "Inform the troops. We're leaving for the Jadira in 20 minutes to train." Kelman exchanged a few glances with Bowers and Leach. "Come on now, soldier," Dominic ordered, and Kelman swung himself off his cot. Muttering sourly, he left the container to knock on the other soldiers' doors. "Bowers?" The young woman jumped down from the edge of the bed onto the floor and took a stance. "Tell Foster to get the transporter ready to go and get Roderick Miles. The Akkato will certainly not allow that." "We'll see about that." Tina Bowers was right, at least to the extent that the hangar crew were watching the activities of the humans with suspicion as they lined up in front of their dwellings and prepared to take off. So it wasn't long before an officer appeared and stood in front of Dominic. A young Akkato who only had a partial command of the human language and became all the more agitated the more his attempts to communicate intelligibly failed. Finally, he fetched one of his superiors, who tried to find out what was going on in adequate French. "I don't speak French," Dominic told him. "Try German, I understand it a bit if you don't want to speak English." The dark-haired giant in his green uniform put his fists on his hips. "Untel Merd. Je ne voulais pas plier ma langue. Mais bien." He gasped as if the idea of having to converse with a human caused him pain. "Je parle un peu l'anglais. I want to go back to the Jadira with my people," explained Dominic. "We are soldiers and haven't had any training sessions for days. There's a risk that we'll lose our effectiveness." "You're actually worried about the strength of your troops?" He made no effort to avoid the throaty accent, which he would certainly have done had he been speaking in French. "If the prince thought he would still need you, I'm sure he would have made sure to drag you and keep you in readiness." "Mestre has a lot to do," explained Dominic. "He might forget something." "You dare too much, little man. How do you know what our prince wants?" "I was just on the bridge," Dominic informed him, and registered with pleasure how the officer swallowed a loo. "You would like that? In your dreams." "He let me look through the big telescope and explained to me that Kade is an important place for his house. He wants to set up some bases before we fly back to Otrakan. And his goal is to rebuild the Kade. You should be aware of that. Don't you? At least that's what he told me. So I'm guessing he'll want to train force with him if he plans to set foot on Barathan again. And it's my job, not the prince's, to provide and implement a training plan." "Porter," growled the horse's head. "Now I recognize you." Dominic didn't know how to interpret Akkato's words, but he seemed to give up his resistance. He merely gritted his teeth for a while until he growled the word "merd," looking Dominic over from head to toe. His dark eyes sparkled excitedly, but after a few moments of hesitation, he made way. The training room on the Jadira was the perfect place for Roderick Miles to demonstrate his talent as a grinder. "What a couple of days of lazing around have turned you into wimps," he shouted through the hall, and wasn't above shouting in Dominic's face when he didn't like something. There were no ranks on the parkour. The drill instructor alone was in charge here. It was amazing how well Miles was able to keep up with all the training sessions and scream his head off during them anyway. The combat training with holographically generated Kimon and Skelks demanded everything from the soldiers. Even Miles was pushed to his limits and was thrown to the ground several times by power surges and force field pulses that simulated hits from firearms or blows from claws, fists or blades. There were several moments when Dominic regretted having started the whole thing. He was grateful when Serwan Brooks showed up and ended the training. "You must realize," he began to rant, "that this ship is a restricted zone." "Because it's involved in a conspiracy?" gasped Dominic. "You're joking. Are they interrogating the ship's computer right now?" "It's a piece of evidence," Brooks said. "Everything that's happened here is under the shadow of suspicion. Then make sure we get training rooms on the Skitra. Then I won't have to come here. You can train with the Akkato there. I can arrange that." The thought frightened Dominic. The Akkato were unpredictable once they were in a rage. They weren't squeamish during their training sessions. He turned to Miles. "Tell the troops to get on with it." Before Brooks could raise an objection, Dominic pushed him aside. The Serwan obviously considered the touch on his arm to be crudely confidential. Indignant, he stood up in front of Dominic. "You should be thankful," Dominic told him again. "For what?" "The period of boredom has led to people worrying," explained Dominic. "And that's not very beneficial." "What are these thoughts?" "Whether we could get caught between the millstones. And whether we might be burned because we now know too much about the intrigues and secrets within House Mestre. Even the prince does not seem to be entirely without dark shadows on his personality." He couldn't say for sure whether his comrades' thoughts were along the same lines. But it was fun to simply throw a stone into the pond and see what the waves washed up on the shore. Indeed, Serwan's otherwise petrified expression showed clear cracks, revealing his uncertainty. "No matter what happens," Brooks said, "you'll do your duty. That's what you were brought in for." "I can see that we understand each other," Dominic said with satisfaction and a hint of arrogance in his words. "I've decided to take care of just that and get people back in line. After training, they'll want nothing more than to sleep instead of asking themselves questions that could undermine their sense of duty." "You speak of betrayal." "I'm talking about disappointment." Dominic was very pleased with his reply. It implied an apology sent in advance, should there be any negligence on the part of the guardsmen. People don't like to serve if they don't trust. And people who no longer have any illusions, or who have to assume that they are being taken for a ride, tend to do stupid things. I don't want to put Mestre at risk just because someone has lost hope. People are concerned about what happened to our predecessors from the start. So far, only a few people know, but I don't think it can remain our dark secret forever. Once that comes out, chaos will break out here. That's why I'm keeping a low profile." "And what about you? Have you sobered up by now?" "I'm in good spirits," Dominic lied. He, too, was convinced that he would experience many more disappointments. "But I always have an even more restless sleep when questions are running through my head. And how can I remedy the situation? I just want to walk part of the way with you and get an idea." "And that's supposed to benefit your troops?" "I strongly assume so." He was very surprised himself that he dared to speak to the Serwan in this way. Could it be a form of desperation that Dominic was not yet ready to admit to himself that made him bolder than was good? "If people see that I'm not plagued by doubts and that I'm in good spirits, it will reassure the troops." Brooks frowned. "The prince has ways and means of making soldiers compliant." "That sounds like helplessness." The Serwan paused for a moment with his words. It was clear that he agreed with Dominic. "My father once told me a story," Dominic continued. "He was a soldier too. A very good one, I've heard. He had a habit of finishing his cigarettes even when the grenades were hitting around his troops. Somehow that always helped to allay his men's fears. At least that's what he told me." "A simple trick," Brooks objected. "If a grenade had hit, there would have been no one to complain about it. The miscalculation and the legend would have died with her father. It seems to have worked often enough. My father had a reputation for invulnerability." "Another MacArthur." Dominic knew what to make of this legendary name. As far as I know, he instilled confidence in his men. Brooks' eyes wandered disparagingly over Dominic. You're taking on too much. You only grow broad shoulders over the years. And they're still too slight to carry loads and smile at the same time. My father was also still very young when he joined the service. He had a lot of responsibility early on. And you think you've inherited some of his skills. I wouldn't mind if I could do something to at least give that impression. Brooks pondered for a while, his face sullen, but then his expression suddenly brightened. Good, I'll give you a few insights. Let's see how that affects your state of mind. That could be exciting. What else am I supposed to do to the troops? Roderick Miles asked as Dominic made preparations to leave with Brooks. Dominic was still finding it difficult to get to grips with his responsibilities as head of the guards. At least the procedure of acting like an officer in routine procedures was still causing him major problems. Go on with the drill as long as you think it's right. What if the prince should need us? Then you're in charge until I rejoin the troops. Miles obviously felt uncomfortable. Dominic knew that he had gladly relinquished command and was reluctant to be forced back into this role. May I know what they're up to? Asked Miles. It's none of my business, but I don't like being the clueless one when people ask me. Of course it was his business. The displeasure of the troops was something that also affected him and that he had to deal with. But outside of the drill, he was too much of a buddy for his comrades and had too little distance to let the anger bounce off him. Brooks is going to show me a few things, Dominic said, that will give me clarity on our situation. For what it's worth, I'm simply traveling with the Serwan. That should be enough information. Miles saluted casually and without bothering to posture. Wish you luck. With that, he turned back to the soldiers, who were involved in a scuffle with holographic opponents. I hope, Brooks said, putting on a skeptical face, that you'll like the information. But I've learned that it's better not to ask questions and not to reveal secrets. Ignorance is often bliss. I say that only as a final warning. Dominic had already had this experience. As I said, the unanswered questions would make me lose sleep, Dominic replied. Then you are one of the patients who want a clear diagnosis. The comparison was perfect. Yes. That pretty much sums it up. But some people can't deal with clear facts. Brooks started to leave the hall while Dominic followed him. I hope you don't overwhelm your people when the cigarette falls out of your mouth. Chapter 8. Serwan Brooks and Dominic boarded a tiny scout ship to fly to Berathan. Serwan sat in the pilot's seat and steered the small craft towards the ruins of the city, which appeared as a star-shaped pattern on the planet's surface. It's called Utrike, Brooks explained. The oldest metropolis in the Akkato Empire. Origin of all the houses of our masters. This information was nothing new to Dominic after the conversation with Mestre. After all, he could praise himself for having already thought along these lines when they came to Berathan with Zurak. So that's why all the fuss. That's just the surface of the whole affair. The ship circled over the rooftops of the city and finally descended towards an airfield where a number of Akkato ships were parked. There was a great deal of activity, indicating how serious the prince was about establishing a base. Utrike is a symbol, Brooks continued. And like any symbol, it has to be filled with content. But the content is different for everyone. As strangers, we at least have the advantage of looking at the matter from the outside. That helps to keep a clear and sober view. The ship touched down. Brooks switched off the engines and stepped outside with Dominic. It was hot outside and the sun was beating down on the airfield as if it wanted to melt the asphalt landing surface. Dust swirled through the air and the noise from the ground and the airplanes was over the city. Brooks took a long stride towards an open transport glider that was being loaded with all kinds of weapons. He spoke to the driver, who told the two people to sit down on the loading area. Shortly afterwards, they set off in the direction of the city center, where the broken stump of the Kadai rose above the houses like a jagged mountain range. Brooks didn't say a word the whole time. He stared at the floor and seemed to be thinking. Dominic could literally see him forming words and sentences in his mind to present to him as precisely placed half-truths or deceptions. There would certainly be a lot left unsaid, and Dominic wished for nothing more than to have the skills of a cool and analytical thinker who could see through any ruse immediately and ask clever counter-questions. At that moment, he thought back to Zyko. Of Zyrus Korin, who had been his comrade on the Zora. Brooks would not have had an easy gain with him. The glider chased along the wide boulevard until it reached one of the archways that led into the interior of the Cadet. The driver stopped there and let his passengers out. There was a lot of confusion here too. Dominic saw a number of Akkato who were not dressed in the uniforms of the fleet. A large ship hovered over the cracked walls of the Cadet, surrounding the abyss Dominic had seen from the ski trough like a huge, sharp-edged crown. The craft was also not part of the fleet and appeared to be civilian, as far as Dominic could tell. He hadn't seen many civilian Akkato ships. No military, he asked uncertainly. Brooks walked leisurely towards the archway. Yes. The prince has requested assistance. Why civilians? These are good people, said Brooks. Logisticians who have proven themselves many times. To come to this conclusion, Dominic didn't even need to call on the wits of his former comrade. Apparently Mestre couldn't spare any more combat units at the moment and had to fall back on civilian service providers. But can't the transport wait? Asked Dominic. At least while they're still fighting elsewhere? You have to take the opportunity as it presents itself, he replied succinctly, crossing his arms behind his back. And there's always a fight somewhere. This stuff had to be important. Dominic guessed weapons and ammunition. But why was all the stuff still here? Why hadn't the Kimon ransacked the tower long ago and taken everything away? They walked through the archway, past the entrances to corridors and passages, until they reached the edge of the shaft, which led down countless floors and stories. For a better view into the abyss, Dominic peered through the struts of a bent railing and recognized platforms on which transporters were being loaded. What's wrong now? Have you lost your tongue? Asked Brooks. However, there was an undertone of tension in his condescending voice, which Dominic perceived quite clearly. Ask your questions. When asked about it directly, he couldn't think of anything. It was only too obvious that important things were being taken away here, and under considerable time pressure to boot. Why did the Kimon leave all this here? Dominic wanted to know. Brooks stepped closer to the railing. They certainly would have done that if they could have. Who stopped them? Brooks smiled sympathetically. Think about it. I'm sure you'll figure it out. Dominic didn't want to say the word. When it came to him, he immediately thought of Stephanie. Gothrex? Gothrex, confirmed the Serwan. Invaluable comrades in arms, even if you are critical of them. Rather the way they come into existence. Dominic swallowed. But there must have been masses of these monsters if they could hold off an army of Kimon for years. As if the thought had attracted them, two of the monsters crept out of one of the corridors. They sniffed the air briefly and then continued on their way without paying any further attention to the two humans. You've proven yourself. Brooks' words were a mixture of disgust and resignation. That will ultimately determine whether or not this program Zurak started is shut down. The prince will not allow that. The remark was rash and due to the indignation Dominic felt. He can't. You expect too much of him. Even Mestre is only human. Brooks waved a soldier over to request a glider, which arrived shortly afterwards. The thing was only used to support the warriors on their patrols and had 6 seats, all of which were occupied. 2 of the 6 Akkato got out to let Brooks and Porter on board. Brooks exchanged a few words with the pilot, who steered the vehicle into the abyss and let it descend further and further until no more daylight seeped into the shaft. The Serwan commented on the increasing darkness that enveloped the vehicle and its occupants. At the bottom of the pit are the oldest relics associated with the Akkato culture. In the dark prehistory of their race, so to speak. The glider touched down on a platform and released its passengers. 2 soldiers secured the perimeter, pointing the barrels of their rifles here and there. Dominic wished he could have told them to relax, because he felt nothing that indicated skelks. Brooks, on the other hand, picked up the pace and went ahead of Dominic into one of the corridors. The other two Akkato caught up, overtaking Brooks and illuminating the rooms and halls they passed through with their hand lamps. Dominic was reminded of a museum, as the rooms were filled with display cases and showcases containing a number of beautiful and just as many gruesome artifacts. "We have to go down a few more floors," Brooks said and pressed a switch at the entrance to a corridor that led downwards. Light flared up. It wasn't particularly bright. Nothing more than emergency lighting. Had the Gothrex maintained the power supply all these years? Although Dominic didn't know much about these monsters, he doubted they were capable of doing so. Brooks ordered the Akkato to wait for them here and set off to penetrate the lower regions of the Kade. He seemed to know exactly where to go to confront Dominic with the frightening facts he had spoken of. After they had walked through several floors, he finally stopped in front of a display case. The contents made Dominic shudder. He looked up into the blank grimace of a grinning mummy skull staring down at him. The face was tattooed and golden earrings shone in the leathery earlobes. The corpse wore a robe of fur and what was visible of its skin showed a pattern of scars from several ritual injuries. The body hovered over a collection of stone and bronze tools. Among them were weapons. Flint knives, arrows and spearheads. Bone and ivory jewelry. "That's Ritzer," Brooks announced. "Kercha, on Akkato. The first involuntary guest of our horse-headed friends." Brooks continued his tour. Past more display cases containing similar mummies. Dominic walked past the gallery in horror and noticed that the clothes and utensils of the dead changed from display case to display case. Fur gave way to fabrics. Coarse linen made way for fine silk. Stone and bronze weapons disappeared, replaced by iron blades and guns. Conquistador Carlos de Santa Miguel, Brooks introduced a corpse holding two flintlock pistols in its clenched fists. He has an exciting story and made it anything but easy for the Akkato to catch him. The Spaniard's body was as well preserved as if he had been alive just a few hours ago. His eyes were half closed and he looked as if he were delirious, plagued by feverish dreams. He wore a red, richly decorated doublet and was wrapped in precious velvet and shiny silk. In addition to a pair of armored gloves made of polished steel, a handsome assortment of knives lay at the tips of his leather knee boots. The macabre exhibition continued. Dominic came face to face with people from the 19th and 20th centuries. Soldiers and civilians of all skin colors. Lined up like showpieces in a cabinet of curiosities. "This is the end of our tour," Brooks announced, pointing to a woman dressed in the fashion of the 5th millennium. Dominic remembered that one of his teachers had worn similar clothes. The sight of the corpse hanging behind the glass was gruesome and brought a cold sweat to Dominic's brow. He licked his dry lips and realized that he was panting with excitement. It took him a few moments to calm down again. And whether he wanted to or not, he almost laughed at the memory of his teacher. A nervous overreaction. Not a new experience, but always disturbing. "And here's to you, Mrs. Robinson," Dominic intoned an old song as he stared into the woman's face. "Jesus loves you more than you will know." Brooks remained serious and focused his attention on Dominic, as if eager to hear his conclusions. "So the Akkato have been visiting us for several millennia," Dominic said once he had regained his composure. "And they're doing their experiments." "What for? To fight the Kimon?" "Yes. That's exactly how it is. Why didn't they occupy our planet right away, back at the time of the pyramids? Then they could have brought enough of us into their laboratories." Earth was still far outside the galactic center, Brooks explained. "Basically, that's still the case now. The Akkato who worked as hunters back then were freelancers who didn't belong to any royal house. They kept their benefices secret. But now, of course, that's over and some Akkato from the princely houses have taken over. But why this secrecy?" Dominic wondered why the Akkato hadn't moved on to kidnapping millions of people to feed them their genetic program. Firstly, Brooks explained. Mestre is against it. He has ideals. And secondly, there is an authority in Askarun that lays down certain rules. Genetic experiments on rational creatures are forbidden. The 10 legates? You determine that? So you've already heard about it. Just rumors. Mestre feels bound by these rules. Unlike his sons, who have no problem with them and go about their business in secret. Will he deliver them to the knife? I have every confidence in him. Ulan Mestre is tough on others when it comes to morality and justice. And also tough on himself. Dominic looked around and pondered the whole situation for a while as he pieced it together from his observations. Could it be that the prince has his back to the wall in the fight against the Kimon? Brooks showed no emotion. The Gothrex would be a good weapon, Dominic concluded, if you didn't have to produce them in secret. Even now, the Serwan remained transfixed. But his silence also meant that Dominic was on the right track. He wondered how much support Ulan Mestre would still have among his people if he wasn't prepared to break new ground to defeat the enemy. How would the Akkato take it if he showed himself more inclined to sacrifice his subjects rather than break a rule or two? By now Dominic knew that the mindset of the Horseheads was hardly any different from that of humans. In this respect, Mestre was sailing close to the wind and would soon feel the wrath of the people. He realized why Brooks did not want to speak openly and avoid the guardsmen finding out. There was already too much unrest and uncertainty. What if the prince simply goes against the 10 legates? Dominic wanted to know. Brooks raised his index finger as if he were a teacher who was about to enrich Dominic with an important truth. You don't do that without sealing your own doom. So you have something like leverage. Yes. And they've already used it. Are they using nuclear weapons? Brooks didn't like the joke, and Dominic realized that the Serwan wouldn't deign to enlighten him on this aspect of the 10 legates' behavior. It was just as well. By now, Dominic had already been given too many dark facts to deal with and did not want to burden his mind with them. Although it was of burning interest to him. So Ulan Mestre is going down with his eyes open, Dominic concluded. One way or another. Honorably and without having broken the rules. Or by the judgment of the legates. Not necessarily. Brooks sighed. There are also legal entities that have already gone to court with the 10 legates. Dominic couldn't help but laugh. You can sue the gods? The 10 legates will bend their own rules if they have to. So God has created a stone that he himself cannot pick up. Brooks raised his eyebrows, impressed. I've never thought of it like that. But it hits the spot. He returned to the previous aspect of their conversation. There are certainly possibilities for genetic experiments that could be legally supported. A good lawyer could successfully defend Zurak's behavior. Dominic was unable to express his opinion on the matter. He was still too much under the influence of the latest findings and the gazes of the dead in their display cases. I have to get out of this morgue, Dominic gasped. Brooks understood and made his way back. He was still taking long strides that betrayed energy and confidence. Dominic, on the other hand, felt miserable and limp. He was struggling to follow the Serwan. The prince's advisors are complaining about the immense costs of the campaign, the Serwan began to say. House Mestre is teetering on the brink of ruin. Dominic had a feeling that the Serwan was prepared to condone Mestre's actions if he decided to continue his son's Gothrek program. Brooks launched into a monologue of justification as they walked through the corridors. The Gothreks are a cheap and effective alternative. With that, Brooks finished his speech as they climbed a ramp, at the end of which the Akkato soldiers were waiting. Dominic realized that Brooks needed the support of the guardsmen if the prince abandoned his ideals. They must not start rebelling or causing trouble. That could lead to the Akkato getting rid of their human soldiers. Anger welled up inside Dominic. Mestre can't want this. Brooks replied curtly. He has to ensure the continued existence of his house. That's why you created Gothreks and made a pact with the devil? Well, why not? They're his own devils. Dominic stopped and sat down on the floor. His eyes almost went black. Brooks stopped and looked down at his young companion. You're finding it hard to keep up the front now, aren't you? The Serwan added. Dominic knew of himself that he was a bad actor and that he would not be able to exude confidence in front of his soldiers if he no longer had any himself. He didn't dare think about what his comrades might do if they had to give up all hope. They need to put aside their ethical concerns, Brooks warned. They're not relevant at the moment. Dominic just looked at him in bewilderment and couldn't utter a word of objection. They see it as their responsibility to keep an escape route open for people. People must remain useful and interesting for Akkato. That's the only thing that matters. I don't understand what you mean. Dominic's pulse raced. Brooks took a deep breath before continuing. He didn't seem to like his own train of thought either, no matter how hard he tried to pretend otherwise in front of Dominic. But he managed a smile like someone ready to deliver the final blow and make a final argument. You need to become a pragmatist. He raised his index finger again in a schoolmasterly manner. Perhaps a distraction gesture to hide the scruples Dominic thought he sensed in his voice. Pragmatist. He let his hands disappear behind his back again. Like your two friends. Davis and Skorsky. Dominic felt even worse when Brooks mentioned those names. What do you know about them? At all times, there have been people who have made common cause with the Akkato hunters, explained Brooks. The Akkato have little knowledge of human habits and use the knowledge of locals to prey on them. History repeats itself across interstellar chasms. English and Americans use Indians to capture Indians. Blacks to bring blacks into slavery or bring them back. Davis and Skorsky? The two of them worked for Gorak. Zurak's younger but more cunning brother. I met them once, but I wasn't yet the Serwan with all my current powers. Yuri Berinsky was Mistray's confidant then. It's unlikely that they remember me. But I know that one fine day they suddenly disappeared. That was about 3 years ago. There was talk of betrayal and theft. So I was all the more surprised when I saw them again in their entourage. Dominic barely dared to say the word. Bounty hunter? Davis and Skorsky certainly see it differently. But we all have problems with our ideals right now. That's why I don't want to hold it against the two of them. I'm far from reproaching them, although I did consider hanging them at the beginning. Rather, I want to know the reasons that led them to take such desperate and dangerous steps. Escape and return. Very exciting. Porter and Brooks remained silent for a while until the Serwan spoke again. Pragmatism. He let the word hover in the room for a few seconds. The survival formula. The magic word of our confused and crazy days. Dominic still didn't understand what Brooks was getting at. When I saw her ad regem. He pointed to Dominic's chest, where he suspected the coin he always carried was. You showed it to Davis and Skorsky, didn't you? That's what made them go with you. Dominic was shocked by the Serwan's conclusions. Jurgen, the dagger, had lost none of its sharpness, as General Ito had mistakenly assumed when Zurak's troops were taken into custody on the Jadira. I had the same thought as Davis and Skorsky when I saw it. Brooks paused again to add weight to his arguments. A new chance. That's what it means. At the beginning, Dominic had also been under the misapprehension that it was an opportunity. But now he was bereft of all illusions. Perhaps he had just chosen the wrong path. He had let himself drift too much instead of acting skillfully and seizing the opportunities, the chance, that the prince's coin put into his hands. Someone with the mind of Brooks could have done far more good with it, or achieved far more for himself. The Serwan was not yet finished with his thoughts. The way I see it, we're going to lose our home planet. Until then, we must manage to get as many people away from there as possible. When that happens, we will rise above ourselves again and survive. As always. But that's only possible if you keep a cool head and throw your scruples overboard. Dominic had no strength left to form an argument to throw at the man. It would only have been an act of defiance anyway, because the horrible thing was that Brooks was right. It wasn't about feeling good. The continued existence of humanity was the priority. How could Dominic even question that? How did he come to put his moral concerns as an obstacle in front of this overwhelming fact? As his despair reached an all-time high, a spark of hope swirled into his dark thoughts. People are always talking about a refuge. He paid attention to every twitch on Serwin's face. A safe world for all refugees. Brooks seemed surprised by this change of thought. He avoided Dominic's gaze for a moment, revealing that he didn't think the refuge planet was just a rumor either. "You know about it," Dominic added. "Yes. So? Its location is not known. You can find out." Brooks seemed to be struggling with himself. "I don't think much of insecure things." "They know more about it," Dominic whispered, afraid the horseheads at the end of the corridor might hear him. "How?" "I heard about a man who was supposed to have made it there. I knew the guy." "Then what's the problem?" Dominic pulled himself to his feet. "If he can do it, then so can we." "You're just not listening carefully," Brooks hissed through his teeth. "If he'd stayed there, we wouldn't know about it. He'd live there, happy and content, until the end of his days. What drove him away?" The Serwan gritted his teeth as if he had to summon all his strength not to slap Dominic. "You remember? Askarun is a place of surprises. Few of them are pleasant. I think it's almost impossible that there could be anything like a paradise out there. And if there is, then there's a catch, as always." He wasn't telling Dominic anything new. Most of the soldiers spoke of it, but always with an undertone of skepticism and doubt. Still, he didn't share Brooks' concerns about Sanctuary, didn't want to share them. He needed a glimmer of hope, no matter how much was against it. No matter what the world of Sanctuary was all about. There was danger around every corner anyway. Dominic hadn't asked Brooks to calculate the odds of surviving the next few years. Anything was better than ending up in one of the tanks and becoming a Gothrek. "I think I'll get over my scruples," Dominic replied. "You're right. We need more humans to ensure the survival of our race." He gradually regained his hope. "As you rightly pointed out, we will rise above ourselves if we have to." Chapter 9. Brooks was more upset about the conversation he'd had with Porter than he wanted to admit. It had made him realize the challenges he was facing and that he might have wasted too much time. He should have started putting his plans into action much earlier. Instead, he tormented himself with his ethical concerns, which, despite his assurances, he was not able to put aside so easily. It was only in conversation with Porter that he realized that he had to convince the prince as quickly as possible to accept more people from Earth into the ranks of the fighters instead of leaving this matter to his sons. It was also important to give the soldiers hope that their future lives would not consist solely of fighting until they died in battle. Or through the intrigues among the ruling houses, which one could fall into more quickly than one thought possible. There had often been resentment among the guardsmen. This was nothing new for Brooks. But since everything had gone well so far, he had simply neglected to take precautions to prevent a revolt. It would have been unthinkable if one of the guardsmen had allowed himself to be carried away into a desperate act. Zurak and Gorak were tough and put their aspirations above all else. But even they would not have been able to cover up an assassination attempt. Mestre would immediately take measures that would only complicate things. Punishment and repression were common but inadequate means. They were capable of forcing even the gentlest person to commit acts of madness. Even now, Porter was still in danger of failing and not succeeding in appeasing the discontent in his troops. Brooks felt it was important to speed things up and make Mestre aware of the need to expand his son's breeding program. And to come clean to the people about Sanctuary. A tricky point, because Mestre didn't think much of the Aponi. He would not allow former fighters to place themselves in the care of these beings and possibly divulge secrets. Mestre received the Serwan in his quarters and listened patiently to his lecture. Every now and then he nodded or smiled to himself. When Brooks came to talk about his son's breeding program, Mestre's expression darkened. However, Brooks knew the prince well enough by now to realize that it was not only indignation at his offspring's actions that darkened his mood. It also reflected the fact that he had few alternatives in the battle with the Kimon. The feeling of being stuck in a dilemma and being tempted to take the only way out. An act of desperation that might end up costing more than Mestre was prepared to pay. We still have enough resources at our disposal, the prince claimed after Brooks had finished speaking, to defeat our enemies. The Serwan mustered all his courage to counter with a difficult argument. Your popularity and your support have been damaged by the Berathan incident. Mestray's expression actually stiffened. His eyes sparkled in suppressed anger. There were many survivors on Berathan, it has now emerged. They've been fighting a losing battle against the Kimon since you left 20 years ago. Word will get around. There have always been rumors over the years that you decided too soon to abandon Berathan and left a lot of Akkato behind. I need not remind you that your opponents have rehashed these accusations again and again and used them against you. Lately, their voices have been getting louder and louder. Mestray certainly knew well enough how his people would judge him. Even among his soldiers there was a clearly perceptible disgruntlement, even though General Ito had made any expression of displeasure a punishable offense. There was no avoiding the fact that the Lord's reputation had been tarnished and admiration for Zurak, whose attack on Berathan had saved the last survivors, had increased. Even if Zurak ultimately cared less about them than the Gothrek experiments on the island of Resker. But not many people were aware of this, and Zurak knew how to use his advantage to portray himself as a hero who rushed to the aid of the desperate. After all, Mestray had done everything in his power to evacuate the survivors, including civilian captains and their ships. But the credit still went to Zurak, who was already known as the hero of Berathan. What's more, Brooks continued, that the Gothreks have proven to be an effective weapon. You are an abomination, the prince groaned so violently that white saliva splashed onto his desk. He wiped his mouth with his hand and went up. Mestray tried to put his indignation into words, but he could not. Ultimately, it's about the survival of two races, Brooks continued. Akkato and humans have their backs to the wall. We should see the Gothreks as an opportunity. As a hint from Otane. That's enough now. Mestray rounded the desk and stomped towards the Serwan with one or two long strides to stand threateningly in front of him. Otane has nothing to do with it, the Akkato rumbled. Rather the Karek and all his Rookie. *FN* Akkato equivalent for Satan and his demons *FN*. I didn't want to hurt your religious feelings, Brooks hastened to assure him. But you did. The prince turned away and looked out through the window at Berathan, behind whose crescent the sun was just disappearing. One last flare that made the atmosphere glow, then the planet was shrouded in darkness. The stars now stood out more clearly, and a purple stellar nebula, invisible in daylight, also shone out. We have to face up to the facts, Brooks began to gently persuade Mestray. The 10 legacies are a fact. Mestray did not turn to Brooks. You can't negotiate with them. My lord, Brooks said, clearing his throat. You very well can. And it's already been done. The prince turned slowly to Brooks. He looked skeptical. I would know about that. It's been a long time, Brooks admitted. About 400 years. But Yuri Berinsky told me about it. You know, he was a bookworm, and after he learned the Akkato language, he studied a lot of writings and got into documentation. I don't remember exactly who was involved, but it was, as in most cases, about the exact definition of terms. Legal interpretations, Yuri said. Expansions of scope and so on. Mestray seemed interested, instead of following his habit of taking the straight path that knew no forks, which in his eyes were nothing but lies. It told Brooks that, contrary to his claim, the prince had already looked into the use of Gothreks. While I was observing Zurak's activities, Brooks continued. I had to look into the whole matter before I decided to come to you with it. However, events brought the matter to light earlier, which of course doesn't make it any easier. To the point, urged the prince. Skelks, which are a component of the Gothrek creature, are not considered rational creatures by the law. Brooks let this aspect sink in, gathered his thoughts to formulate the following points precisely, and then continued. The law on genetic modification in living beings is only applied to thinking creatures. It does not take into account the Skelks, who are considered to be animals. But I am sure that the legates consider people to be rational. I'm honored, Brooks remarked. As far as I understand the technical process, the human component of the Gothrek is not subject to genetic modification. Are you sure about that? Quite. After a brief moment of thought, the Serwan corrected himself. No. I'm sure of it. The human genome is not modified in the process. Mestre pursed his lips and tapped his chin. So if the 10 legates were to accuse me, I could contradict them on a legal level. Yes, that would be possible. It's even very plausible if you think it through, which is precisely why it can stand up in court. Brooks wondered how long it had taken Mestre to come to terms with the idea of using his son's wonder weapon. The survivors of Berathan and the effect they had on public opinion must have caused him to quickly abandon his previous scruples. I just wonder how we managed to bring people here. Mestre mused aloud. Kidnapping isn't something that stands up in the eyes of the law either. I'm sure of that. We have to offer them something. A home. An alternative to Earth. What else can we offer them but war and fighting? Then we tell them exactly that. You will have an adventure. Only the best will stand their ground. For many, that's certainly enough incentive to join us. Mestre looked skeptical. I'll have to think about it. I'll let you know when I've come to a decision. Brooks made no move to leave and instead stared sheepishly at the tips of his boots. What else is there? Mestre sounded like he was at the end of his tether. Of course, it would be advisable to offer the soldiers who are wounded or can no longer fight a better home than this hospital ship circling the desert world of Paraima. You know that my people are very intolerant of strangers. Brooks knew that. In this respect, the Akkato were more narrow-minded and backward-looking than most of the Ascaroon peoples. If you could make them understand how important we humans are to you and how much they owe us, that might change. When peace has come, the heroic deeds of war are hardly remembered, the prince objected. Peace brings its own problems. Once you've become fat, every extra eater at the table feels like a thief. Brooks had to agree with him. The history of mankind was also full of such examples. But Brooks had something else in mind. His vision offered more prospects of independence. Albeit on a more modest scale to begin with. I'm thinking of the Durana. Mestre acted puzzled, although Brooks suspected he knew exactly what he was getting at. The ship is a misconstruction. I don't think so, the Serwan disagreed, earning a displeased look from Akkato. From what I've heard, it's actually very successful. Only the sheer size is a problem. For his vision, however, the dimensions of the ship were just right. The Durana has been lying in the space dock that was built especially for her for a good 100 years. The segments were made from panta wood, which should have come together to form a solid body by now. You want me to give it to people? I think it would be good for us to have some kind of home. A ship is a better symbol than a station orbiting a dead world. A ship means freedom. Which I can't give you, Mestre admitted frankly. Not without endangering you all. Of course that was a pretext. The humans would stand their ground. And all the better if they had a ship. Besides, he had no problem exposing them to every conceivable danger on the mine worlds. Mestre tapped his chin. I could call off an Akkato crew to run the ship. That would be better, of course. Brooks had obviously let the bland answer slip from his lips. In any case, Mestre didn't give the impression that he distrusted his Serwan. After all, the suggestion was audacious, offering the humans a way to make themselves independent and disappear. Zurak would never have agreed to such a proposal. Chapter 10. Dominic was on his way to the Serwan's quarters when Davis and Skorsky joined him. They came out of a side corridor that led into the main corridor and had obviously taken the same route as him. He didn't think it was a chance encounter, or that the two of them wanted to stretch their legs for a moment. Brooks must have called them to him and Dominic didn't like that at all. Looks like a convention, Skorsky said succinctly, while Davis made his first scowl. Arriving at the Serwan's quarters, Dominic activated the signaling device. Seconds later, the door opened and the three men entered. The dark room was illuminated by a single lamp set into the wall behind Brooks, casting a pale, bluish glow reminiscent of a winter twilight. In front of it was the silhouette of Serwan, who was sitting behind his desk and was obviously alone. "Have a seat," he invited his 3 guests, pointing to 3 cushions in front of the table. After they had taken their seats in the soft cushions, Brooks let a few seconds pass before he addressed Davis and Skorsky. "Only Porter hasn't had any experience with Gorak Mestre. But you two certainly know Zurak's younger brother very well. Tell me if I'm wrong." Skorsky shifted nervously in his seat, but when he tried to respond to Brooks' words, Davis held him back. "Gorak Mestre is known to us," Davis admitted. "Oh, I think more than that." The Serwan leaned forward and placed his hands on the polished tabletop. "You brought humans to him, and you were supposed to bring more humans to him. Let me guess that whatever Zurak expected you to do didn't happen." He took a few seconds, scrutinizing Davis and Skorsky. "You betrayed his trust in many ways." Dominic was all ears and watched intently as the 2 men reacted to the accusations. Davis in particular seemed calm and did not appear worried. He accepted Brooks' words and seemed to be awaiting further information and accusations. It almost seemed to Dominic as if he was relieved that the matter Brooks was talking about had finally come to light. "I also know why you're back here with us," Brooks continued. "You expect Mestre's gift to Porter to be something of a free pass for you. An invitation that leads directly to the prince's palace and thus to the safety they lost on Earth." Davis did not deny this. "Your reasoning is not so wrong when you accuse us of having selfish motives. But you're only scratching the surface. I wish it were easier to shed the consequences of an altruistic upbringing, but it's harder than you think. Moreover, we would be foolish not to have taken advantage of this gift. If the survival instinct is an expression of pure selfishness for them, then I guess we are. Did they call us here so that they could tell us that? Or that we are now on our knees begging for forgiveness? Forgiveness for doing everything we could to save our skin? No, of course not," Brooks replied calmly. "We're all just saving our skins. But it's always a question of how far we go." Skorsky laughed. "I don't really feel like listening to any additional advice that I can come up with myself to make me feel better. I just want to tell you that it depends on my goodwill whether you meet Gorak again or not. And what's going on here now?" Brooks leaned back in his chair again. "You were a manhunter. How explosive do you think this information is?" Davis's composure wavered only slightly. "We never were," he retorted, with a well-measured hint of annoyance. "We have upheld the law and saved many lives. Gorak must settle his actions with his conscience. Not us. We got out." Brooks accepted Davis's justification. "I'm prepared to believe you. After all, your annoyance shows that you at least imagine you have ideals. What's all this about?" Davis exhaled audibly. "What do you want from us?" "That you will resume your work," Brooks replied calmly. "Only under better, or rather, different conditions. And I'm sure I'll be able to open doors with you." Dominic expected the 2 men to resist and make it clear to the Serwan that they were not prepared to do the dirty work for anyone. And the whole thing was still a challenge for Dominic too, ever since the Serwan had confronted him with his plan during the trip to the vaults of the Cadet. Something inside him wished that Davis and Skorsky would refuse, or at least raise an objection. But as Brooks correctly realized, they saw the whole situation as an opportunity for humanity as much as he and the Serwan did. Nevertheless, a brief rebellion, a brief moral outrage, would have earned them both sympathy points with Dominic. He called himself a fool while he thought about it. Did every conspirator have such thoughts while he was making treacherous plans? Justifications that excused his actions? They would deceive countless, desperate people and turn them into monsters in the end. But it could just as well mean the transition to another, a higher existence. Dominic could at least accept this excuse if it weren't for the fact that it involved lies and deception. "Porter?" Brooks snapped him out of his musings. "Are you still with us?" Dominic had missed the last words. "I just did," he stammered. "I'm just about to." "Finding your scruples again?" Dominic almost answered yes. "We are in agreement. But of course I don't know how the rest of the squad will deal with our mission. That's a problem we'll deal with when the time comes. Dominic knew that it would already be too late by the time the matter was discussed among the troops and the different points of view clashed. Basically, they were faced with another problem that endangered the unity of the guardsmen. Davis turned his attention back to the Serwan. "Why are you even making an issue of this?" He made an irritated face. "It's always a question of how you sell a thing, isn't it?" Brooks raised his eyebrows and waited for Davis to explain his thoughts. Dominic was also eager to hear what he had to say, because so far all his arguments had been well thought out and difficult to refute. "You assume that everyone views this fate of becoming a Gothrak with disgust. Am I right?" Brooks remained motionless in his chair and fixed Davis with a serious look. "I would prefer to remain human." "I'm not denying that." Davis turned to Dominic for a moment and grinned wryly. "How deep are you into this stuff?" "I've seen enough," Dominic replied. "When you're under stress and also scared, you miss out on a lot of things." Brooks put his fingertips together to form a gable over which he watched Davis. Dominic couldn't shake the feeling that the Serwan had just admitted to overlooking a few important details. He seemed to be eagerly waiting for Davis to illuminate a few dark spots with his findings. "I had the opportunity to talk to your roommates," Davis continued. "I was able to get an idea from what they said. According to them, Zurak doesn't need many people to produce his creatures. Possibly even just one person out of hundreds. I assume that our predecessor force also consisted of a good 100 men." His attention switched back to Brooks, who nodded briefly. "There were at most 10 to 12 people in the tanks that were in operation, according to the comrades from Porter's entourage. Guardswoman Dormer seemed to have a special role to play. Interestingly, before she was integrated into the breeding program, she seemed to develop some amazing abilities. Skills that earned her a special position in Zurak's project." The choice of words made Dominic want to jump out of his skin and go for Davis's throat. But he pulled himself together and merely gritted his teeth as the former bounty hunter continued with his explanations. "The other guardsmen," Davis continued, "apart from the handful of chosen ones who were given special treatment with Dormer, gave Porter's comrades the impression that they were in storage. Replacements, in case the premium objects failed. In any case, there were a lot of containers standing off to the side, serving no particular purpose. They had contents consisting of our lost predecessors." Dominic looked at Brooks, who was listening intently to Davis's words. Even if he tried to cover it up, he seemed to admire Davis and his powers of deduction. When Davis took a long pause in his lecture, the Serwan waved his hand impatiently to find out more. "I assume that Zurak had the remaining soldiers disappear into the tanks to avoid unrest when supplies arrived." Brooks nodded. "Yes, that was his reasoning. A human leader would have made use of the idealism of his soldiers. Above all, the almost religious willingness to sacrifice that we humans are capable of when we believe we can reach a higher level. Or what we are capable of when we believe we are serving a god or a leader." Dominic blurted out a conclusion. "You want to establish a religion?" Davis looked at Dominic admiringly for a moment. "That would be too much to start with. A religion takes time," he philosophized. "We'll take the first step and establish a cult first." He let some time pass before he completed the thought. "As far as I know, believers finish the path once they have been led onto the path of enlightenment. They then move forward in blazing zeal." Davis turned his eyes to the ceiling and gestured, expressing his utter disdain for people who followed any movement or religious doctrine. They stride forward in absolute self-denial, wherever their supposed destiny may lead them. Dominic became angry. "They hate people." "No, I don't," Davis replied sharply. "I respect anyone who doesn't deny their sanity." There was silence for a few seconds. Dominic searched for a retort, but he couldn't think of one that went beyond mere defiance. Brooks tried not to let on that he was impressed by Davis. But somehow Dominic suspected that the Serwan had found an equal spirit in his counterpart, for whom he could not deny his respect. "Back to the subject," the Serwan prompted. "What about the people who don't see their destiny in becoming a monster?" These people are a problem. Davis didn't seem particularly rattled. Those who don't want to take the path don't have to, but we will demand that everyone supports the sacrifice of a believer. That way, everyone has a clear conscience, depending on their disposition and possibilities. One is a martyr, the other as his supporter. There was no denying it. This plan was sound, however perfidious it was in Dominic's eyes. The recruits could be given a clean slate from the outset and didn't have to worry about the decisions the individual made. You simply handed over responsibility. Dominic also believed that there would be enough people who were prepared to go crazy. Gothrecs were strong and impressive. It could well be that quite a few people saw them as a kind of desirable transformation into something divine. In all cults, people showed a willingness to mutilate or deny themselves, even to the point of complete self-abandonment. Seen in this light, what they would offer the future guardsmen was nothing unusual. For some, it might even be a great gift. Nevertheless, Dominic wasn't comfortable with it. It just didn't feel right. Neither he nor Brooks, Davis or Skorsky had the right to become the founders of a cult, or even the founders of a religion. The idea had the potential to become a kind of faith. A religion that was based on deception and misdirection from the very beginning. In an unpleasant way, Dominic felt reminded of a Führer movement he had heard about in history lessons. An ideology that had recently taken on such excesses that it could serve as a symbol of absolute evil. It had given rise to a generation of people who no longer valued their own lives, which were only of value if they could use them to serve their supposed God. But despite all his reservations, Dominic had to admit that the best way to carry out the project was to get as many people off the earth as possible and thus save them. He would go along with it in the hope of ultimately doing some good.